The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with anticipation and the faint hum of whispered speculation. Every pair of eyes was riveted on Danielle Carter as she rose from her seat. With the grace of someone who knew the weight of the moment but refused to buckle beneath it, she smoothed the lapels of her tailored blazer, her movements deliberate, almost meditative, as if she were steadying herself for the storm she was about to unleash. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that pulsed with every breath, every rustle of paper. Turning her sharp gaze toward the judge, she spoke, her voice slicing through the charged silence with surgical precision. "Your Honor," she began, each syllable measured, resonant, a quiet thunder rolling through the space. "Before we proceed with this trial, there's a matter I must bring to light." Across the room, Greg Larson sprawled in his chair at the plaintiff's table, the picture of arrogance, his broad shoulders pressed against the backrest, one arm slung casually over the armrest, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. To him, Danielle was nothing more than another name on a docket, another face in a long line of people he'd bent to his will with the flash of a badge and a barked command. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with the lazy confidence of a predator sizing up prey he assumed was already cornered. The judge, perched high on her bench, adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and leaned forward, her brows arching in curiosity. "Go ahead, Miss Carter," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes glinting with intrigue. Danielle paused, letting the silence stretch taut, her dark eyes locking onto Larson's with an intensity that seemed to pin him in place. Then, with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years wielding truth as a weapon, she dropped her bombshell. "I am Danielle Carter," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the room. "A federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The words landed like a grenade, the shockwave rippling outward in gasps and stifled murmurs. Larson's smirk vanished as if slapped from his face, his ruddy complexion draining to a sickly pallor. His fingers, once relaxed, now clutched the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as the reality of his miscalculation sank in. His attorney, a weary man with a pinched face, shifted in his seat, his hands fumbling with a stack of papers as though searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Danielle's lips curved into the ghost of a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only the steely resolve of a woman who'd been underestimated one too many times. "It appears Mr. Larson filed this lawsuit without the faintest idea of who he was targeting," she continued, her tone unwavering, each word a deliberate step toward his unraveling. "But I assure you, Your Honor, that oversight is about to become exceedingly relevant." The courtroom erupted into a low buzz, spectators leaning toward one another, their whispers a chorus of disbelief and fascination. Larson squirmed, his bravado crumbling like dry clay, his broad chest heaving as he struggled to regain his footing in a battle he hadn't anticipated. The judge tapped her gavel once, a sharp crack that silenced the murmurs. She peered over her glasses at Danielle, her expression inscrutable, and nodded. "Noted. Miss Carter, let us proceed." As Danielle eased back into her seat, her mind drifted, pulling her back to a night 3 months earlier, a night that had set this collision course in motion. It had been a sweltering summer evening in downtown Chicago, the kind where the humidity clung to your skin like a second layer, and the city's pulse thrummed through the streets. Dressed in faded jeans and a lightweight blouse, Danielle had just left a cozy dinner with friends, their laughter still echoing in her ears as she made her way to her Tesla parked along a shadowed curb. The air smelled of asphalt and distant rain, the streetlights casting long, wavering pools of gold across the pavement. She'd barely clicked the key fob, the car's lights flashing in response, when the shrill wail of a siren split the night. A patrol car screeched to a stop behind her, its red and blue lights painting the scene in jagged streaks. 2 officers stepped out, their boots heavy on the concrete. "Hey, you." The voice was sharp, commanding, laced with an edge of disdain. Danielle turned slowly, her hands rising instinctively to show they were empty, her heart kicking up a notch despite her outward calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone steady, though a flicker of unease coiled in her chest. Greg Larson strode toward her, his presence imposing, his hand resting on the holster at his hip as if it were an extension of himself. His eyes raked over her, cold and appraising, his jaw set in a hard line. "We've had reports of a black woman breaking into cars around here," he said, his voice thick with accusation, the words dripping with a prejudice he didn't bother to conceal. "You fit the description." Danielle's brow lifted, a spark of indignation flaring behind her composed exterior. "This is my car," she replied evenly, gesturing toward the Tesla. "I can show you my ID and registration." Larson ignored her, his gaze narrowing as he barked, "Hands on the carno." For a fleeting moment, Danielle hesitated, the weight of his command pressing against her sense of dignity. But she complied, placing her palms flat against the warm hood, her fingers splaying as she fought to keep her breathing steady. Larson stepped closer, too close, his rough hands patting her down with a force that bordered on violation. The second officer, younger, with a mop of sandy hair and a nervous twitch in his jaw, lingered a few feet back, his eyes darting between Larson and Danielle. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing, his silence a tacit endorsement of the scene unfolding before him. "Careful, officer," Danielle said, her voice low and controlled, though a thread of anger wove through it. "You're crossing a line." Larson smirked, undeterred, yanking her wallet from her pocket without so much as a glance for permission. He flipped it open, his thick fingers pausing as they brushed across her federal ID. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of doubt, but he smothered it quickly, tossing the wallet back onto the hood with a dismissive grunt. "You're clean," he muttered, stepping back, but instead of retreating, he reached for his citation pad, scribbling with a flourish that suggested this was routine. A petty flex of power he relished. Danielle's jaw tightened, her pulse hammering in her ears. "A citation for what?" she asked, her voice cutting through the humid air. "Loitering," Larson replied curtly, ripping the ticket free and thrusting it toward her. "Consider this a warning, and hang around here too long." She took the paper without breaking eye contact, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment as she noted his badge, Officer G. Larson. The name seared itself into her memory, a quiet vow forming in the depths of her mind. As he turned to leave, the younger officer lingered, his gaze meeting hers. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of guilt, a silent apology he didn't have the courage to voice. He opened his mouth, then closed it, retreating to the cruiser like a shadow. Across the street, a bystandera weary man in a faded Cubs cap raised his phone, the faint glow of the screen illuminating his face as he recorded the encounter. "What's going on here?" he called, his voice tremulous, but defiant. Larson's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Put the phone away," he snapped, striding toward the man with a menace that made the air crackle. "Unless you want to spend the night in a cell," the bystander faltered, his resolve crumbling as he lowered the device, casting an apologetic glance at Danielle before hurrying off into the night. Alone now, Danielle slid into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, anger and disbelief warring within her. In the rearview mirror, Larson's silhouette lingered, his smirk a phantom that haunted her as she pulled away. She didn't know it then, but that moment had lit a fuse of fire that would burn through every layer of Larson's arrogance and the corrupt system that propped him up. Back in the courtroom, the gavel's sharp bang snapped her to the present. The trial had begun, and across the room, Larson's glare bore into her, his earlier swagger replaced by a brittle unease. His attorney whispered furiously, beads of sweat dotting his brow, but Larson waved him off, his eyes never leaving Danielle. She met his stare, unflinching, a quiet storm brewing behind her composed facade. This wasn't just about her, she thought, her resolve hardening like steel. This was about every soul he'd crushed under his heel, every life he'd dismissed with a sneer. Justice wasn't just a word to her, it was a reckoning, and she'd see it through to the end. 2 weeks after that stifling night, a thick envelope arrived from the courthouse, its weight ominous in her hands. Tearing it open, Danielle felt a jolt as her eyes scanned the summons. Plaintiff, Officer Greg Larson. Defendant, Danielle Carter. Charges, defamation, harassment. A bitter laugh escaped her, sharp and incredulous. He was suing her, spinning a tale that she'd intimidated him, threatened him, a brazen lie so absurd it bordered on parody. She saw his game instantly, flip the narrative, paint himself as the victim, and bury her credibility before she could strike back. Dropping the papers onto her desk, she leaned back in her chair, her mind racing like a river breaching its banks. Her assistant, Julia, a whip-smart woman with a cascade of auburn curls, knocked softly before stepping in. "You okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she caught the storm in Danielle's eyes. "Larson just sued me," Danielle said flatly, sliding the summons across the desk. Julia skimmed it, her green eyes widening in disbelief. "Harassment. He's covering his tracks," she said, her voice tight with outrage. Danielle nodded, her fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the armrest. "And he's not stopping there. I've heard whispers rumors spreading like wildfire." Frowning, Julia tilted her head. "What kind of rumors?" Danielle grabbed her phone, pulling up a police forum she'd been monitoring. The posts were venomous, a digital cesspool of lies. Carter's abusing her power to ruin a good cop. Typical move, play the race card when she doesn't get her way. She's out to destroy Larson for doing his job. Julia shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He's rallying them against you," she said, her voice low. "This isn't just a lawsuit, it's a war." Danielle's gaze hardened, her thoughts crystallizing into a single truth. Larson had underestimated her, but he'd soon learn the cost of wielding power without conscience. Justice demanded consequences, and she'd deliver them with every ounce of her being. The air in Danielle's office felt thick with tension as she sat hunched over her desk. Her eyes narrowed at the glowing screen before her. "Building a narrative, and it's working," she muttered, her voice low and edged with a bitterness that had been simmering for weeks. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as the weight of her unraveling world pressed down on her. At work, the shift was palpable. Colleagues she'd once laughed with over coffee now averted their gazes. When she passed by in the halls, some shuffled their feet awkwardly, their eyes darting to the floor as if meeting hers might implicate them in her troubles. Others whispered behind cupped hands, their words too faint to catch but sharp enough to wound. Her reputation, a fortress she'd constructed brick by brick through years of relentless dedication, was crumbling under an onslaught of doubt. Was she, as some now speculated, exploiting her authority to exact revenge on a personal enemy? The thought gnawed at her, twisting her stomach into knots as she replayed every decision she'd made, searching for the moment it all went wrong. Determined to wrest back control, Danielle turned to the one lifeline she had left, the body cam footage from that fateful night. It wasn't just evidence, it was her anchor, a raw, unfiltered testament to what had really happened during Officer Larson's stop. She could still feel the heat of that evening, the way the air had crackled with tension as Larson's voice barked orders, his hands moving with a roughness that felt personal. That footage held the truth, captured in grainy frames and shaky audio, and she clung to it like a drowning woman to a raft. But when she logged into the system to retrieve it, her fingers froze over the keyboard as a stark red message flashed across the screen. "Access denied." Her breath caught in her throat, and she stared at the words, her pulse quickening as disbelief morphed into fury. "They're blocking me," she said aloud, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and betrayal. She grabbed her phone and dialed Julia, her most trusted confidant, her words spilling out the moment the call connected. "Someone's tampering with the system, he can't get the files." Julia stormed into the office minutes later, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor, her face a mask of steely resolve. She was a weary woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper instincts, a paralegal who'd seen enough corruption in her career to recognize its stench from a mile away. "This isn't an accident," she said, planting her hands on Danielle's desk and leaning in close. "Someone higher up doesn't want that footage to see the light of day." Her dark eyes glinted with defiance, and Danielle felt a flicker of hope amid the chaos. "Then I'll get it another way," she replied, her jaw tightening until it ached. She straightened in her chair, her mind racing as she mapped out her next move. "Call Emily. We're taking this to court." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the next hearing began, a cavernous space of polished wood and muted whispers. Danielle sat rigid in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Emily Turner, her attorney, stood before the judge with the poise of a seasoned warrior. Emily was a striking figuretti and lean, with a cascade of auburn hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her voice steady as she addressed the bench. "Your Honor, the defense demands immediate access to the plaintiff's body cam footage from the night in question. It's not just relevant, it's the cornerstone of our case." Across the aisle, Charles Reed, Larson's attorney, sprang to his feet like a coiled snake striking. He was a weary man with a hawkish nose and a voice that dripped with calculated charm. "Objection, Your Honor. That footage has no bearing on the claims of defamation and harassment. It's a distraction." His words hung in the air, smooth and rehearsed, but Emily didn't flinch. She turned to him, her green eyes flashing like blades. "Irrelevant. That footage lays bare exactly what happened between my client and Officer Larson. The jury deserves to see it, unfiltered." The judge, a stern figure with gray hair and a face carved from years of deliberation, leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. Silence stretched across the room, broken only by the faint rustle of papers as he weighed their arguments. Finally, he nodded. "Motion granted. The footage will be provided to the defense." A ripple of tension coursed through the courtroom. Reed's lips pressed into a thin, dark line, his composure cracking just enough for Danielle to notice. Beside him, Larson shifted in his seat, his broad shoulders hunching as his jaw clenched tight, a muscle twitching beneath his stubbled cheek. Victory, however fleeting, tasted sweet, but it was short-lived. Days turned into weeks, and Danielle's team found themselves mired in a swamp of excuses. Files mysteriously vanished. Systems crashed with inexplicable technical errors. Documents were misplaced in a bureaucratic labyrinth. Each delay fueled her frustration, a slow burn that seared through her chest as she paced her office late into the night, the city lights glittering coldly beyond her window. One evening, as the sky outside darkened with heavy clouds, Julia's voice crackled through the phone with an urgency that snapped Danielle out of her exhaustion. "I've been digging through old case records tied to Larson," Julia said, her tone taut with discovery. "You're not going to believe what I found." Danielle gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles whitening. "Tell me," Julia's words tumbled out, each one landing like a stone in still water. "There's a pattern, Lewitz. Claims of harassment, defamation, even intimidation, all filed by Larson against anyone who's dared to stand up to him. Most of them Black or Latino. At least 5 in the last 3 years. And get this, almost every single case was either dropped quietly or settled out of court." The revelation hit Danielle like a punch to the gut, her stomach twisting as the pieces fell into place. "He's done this before," she whispered, her voice thick with disgust. "It's a playbook." Julia's agreement was grim. "Exactly. And it's not just about protecting himself, it's about crushing anyone who might expose what he really is." Beyond the walls of her office, the storm spilled onto social media, where Danielle had become both a pariah and a rallying cry. Hashtags like Justice for Larson clashed with Stand with Carter, igniting virtual battlefields in comment sections that overflowed with venom and solidarity in equal measure. Late one night, she sat alone in her apartment, the blue glow of her laptop illuminating her weary face. As she scrolled through a particularly vicious thread, each hateful word felt like a splinter under her skin, piercing deeper with every line. She wasn't naive. She'd known the pursuit of justice would paint a target on her backbit. The sheer ferocity of it all staggered her, leaving her chest hollow. Yet, as the clock ticked past midnight, a new resolve surged through her veins, hot and unyielding. Larson's tactics were meant to break her, to wear her down until she surrendered. But Danielle Carter didn't bend. She didn't break. The next morning, Emily burst into her office, a flash drive clutched triumphantly in her hand. "We finally got it," she said, her voice ringing with a fierce satisfaction that mirrored Danielle's own. They huddled around her laptop as she plugged in the drive, the screen flickering to life with the grainy footage from Larson's body cam. The scene unfolded just as Danielle remembered: humid night air, the glare of streetlights, Larson's towering figure looming over her. His voice cut through the static, harsh and commanding, his hands unnecessarily rough as he patted her down, his tone laced with a hostility that felt like a personal vendetta. But then, something new jolted her from the familiar replay. "Put the phone away, or you'll regret it," Larson snapped, his head whipping toward a bystander filming the encounter. Danielle's finger hovered over the pause button, her breath catching as she locked eyes with Emily. "Did you hear that?" Emily's lips curved into a sharp, victorious grin. "Threatening a civilian for recording him. That's abuse of power. Plain as day. It's gold, Danielle." Armed with the footage and Julia's damning research, Danielle and Emily threw themselves into preparing for the trial's next phase. They knew Larson and Reed would claw desperately to discredit the evidence, twisting every detail to fit their narrative. But Danielle felt the tide shifting, the truth a solid weight in her hands. "This isn't just about me," she said to Emily one evening, the two of them surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and steaming coffee cups. "It's about every single person he's tried to bury. If we don't stop him now, he'll keep doing this over and over." Emily's nod was firm, her eyes gleaming with the same fire that burned in Danielle's chest. "Then let's make sure he never gets the chance." As the trial loomed closer, a broader picture emerged, one that chilled Danielle to her core. Larson wasn't a lone wolf who was a cog in a machine, shielded by others who hid behind the same corrupt system that had blocked her access. Buried files and silenced voices. This fight wasn't just about clearing her name anymore, it was about dismantling the entire rotten framework that let men like Larson thrive unchecked. The courtroom doors swung open on the first day of trial, and Larson strode in with an air of unshakable confidence. He adjusted his tie with a practiced flick, his broad chest puffed out as he cast occasional glances at the jury, a smirk tugging at his lips. Reed paced before the bench, his movements deliberate, his presence a quiet storm of authority. Across from him, Emily stood like a sentinel, her calm exterior belying the razor-sharp mind beneath. Danielle sat beside her, her posture unyielding, her eyes locked on Larson with a quiet intensity that promised reckoning. Reed launched into his opening statement, his voice smooth as polished stone, each word a carefully placed seed of doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't about justice, it's about a defendant who wielded her power to intimidate an officer, simply doing his job. Officer Larson, a dedicated public servant, has been unjustly targeted by someone chasing headlines over truth." Danielle's jaw tightened, her fingernails digging into her palms, but she held her silence. Emily leaned close, her breath warm against Danielle's ear. "He's piling it on thick," she murmured as Reed sat down. Then Emily rose, her voice cutting through the room like a blade honed to perfection. "This case is about accountability, an officer who overstepped his bounds and thought he could manipulate the system to bury his tracks. The truth doesn't bow to lies. It's clear and it's devastating." Reed's scoff echoed through the chamber. "Objection, Your Honor." Counsel is inflaming the jury with rhetoric. The judge's nod was slight, his voice dry. "Sustained. Keep to the facts, Ms. Turner." Emily didn't waver, her expression as steady as stone. "I will, Your Honor." The trial's opening hours unfolded in a tense dance of accusations and rebuttals. Reed painted Danielle as a predator, a federal prosecutor who'd weaponize her influence to menace Larson, hurling claims of veiled threats and power plays. During cross-examination, he leaned forward, his eyes glinting with challenge. "Ms. Carter, your role gives you considerable sway over legal proceedings, correct?" Danielle met his stare, her voice even as steel. "Yes, it does," Reed pressed on, his tone syrupy with insinuation. "And wouldn't that sway intimidate someone in Officer Larson's position?" She didn't blink. It could if that person weren't spinning lies to dodge accountability. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the air electric with the weight of her words. The lesson was stark and unyielding. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed, it was a battle fought, inch by bloody inch. Larson's abuse of power, and the system that propped him up, cast long shadows over the lives he'd touched, a reminder that unchecked authority could rot even the strongest foundations. For Danielle, every step of this were every lost file, every venomous tweet, every courtroom skirmish hammered home the cost of standing up, and the far greater cost of staying silent. In the dimly lit courtroom, Reed's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face as he leaned forward, his voice sharp yet controlled. "So, you're telling me you deny ever using your authority to intimidate Officer Larson after that coup?" His words hung in the air, laced with skepticism. Danielle, seated across from him, straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing slightly as she met his gaze without hesitation. "Absolutely," she replied, her tone resolute, carrying the weight of someone who had nothing to hide. "The only thing I've ever done is chase the truth relentlessly, unapologetically." Reed's lips curled into a faint smirk, as though he'd anticipated her defiance. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "let's leave it to the jury to decide whether your version of truth holds any water." As the trial unfolded, the atmosphere grew heavier, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering tension. Reed shifted his approach. No longer content with challenging Danielle's story, began targeting her personally. During a brief recess, he paced near the jury box, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry. "This isn't the first time we've seen someone pull stunts like this. People desperate for attention love to stir the pot with controversy." His words were a calculated jab, meant to plant seeds of doubt in the jurors' minds. Emily, Danielle's sharp-witted attorney, didn't miss a beat. She shot to her feet, her voice cutting through the murmur of the room. "Your Honor, opposing counsel's remarks are entirely inappropriate and blatantly prejudicial." The judge, perched behind her towering bench, cast a fleeting glance at Reed. Her silence spoke volumes, a subtle hesitation that hinted at an unspoken bias. Danielle caught it immediately, her keen eyes narrowing as she leaned toward Emily. "Let it go," she murmured, her voice low but firm. "We'll fight this with the evidence, not their games." The courtroom's energy shifted dramatically when Emily unveiled her ace, body camera footage. From that fateful night, Reed leapt up, his chair scraping against the floor as he bellowed, "Your Honor, I object. This video has no bearing on the charges of defamation and harassment. It's a cheap distraction." Emily didn't flinch. She turned to the judge, her voice steady and commanding. "This footage captures the very interaction Officer Larson's claims hinge on. It's not just relevant, it's essential to understanding what really happened." The judge paused, her fingers tapping lightly on the gavel as she weighed her decision. Then, with a curt nod, she ruled, "Overruled. The video will be shown." As the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the room, every pair of eyes fixed on the flickering screen. The footage crackled to life. Larson's patrol car rolled to a stop behind Danielle's sleek Tesla, its headlights casting stark shadows across the pavement. His voice sliced through the speaker, harsh, authoritative, barking orders with an edge of aggression that set the tone from the outset. The camera jostled as he approached, his figure looming over Danielle, hands on the hood. "No." He snapped, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The video showed her complying, her movements slow and deliberate, yet he grabbed her arms, forcing them down harder than necessary, his hands patting her down with a roughness that felt personal. Then came the moment that sent a ripple through the courtroom. "Another one of you people thinking you're above the law," Larson sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Gasps erupted from the gallery, a wave of shock rolling through the spectators. Danielle sat motionless, her face a mask of composure, but the air around her crackled with unspoken fury. Reed shot up again, his face flushed. "Objection. That statement's been ripped out of context." Emily didn't let him finish. "Out of context," she countered, her voice rising with indignation. "Those are his exact words, caught on tape. The video doesn't, Lee Larson does." The judge's gavel came down hard, silencing the escalating clash. "Overruled," she said firmly. "The jury will assess the evidence for themselves." As the screen faded to black, a heavy silence settled over the room, Larson's words lingering like a bitter aftertaste. Reed, desperate to regain control, turned to the jury during a break, his tone smooth but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't be swayed by a single offhand remark. It doesn't define intent. Let's not rush to judgment." But the damage was done. The jurors' sidelong glances betrayed their growing doubts, their faith in Larson's story beginning to fray. Emily pounced on the opportunity. In her next argument, she stood tall, her voice resonating with conviction. Officer Larson's own words and actions shred his credibility. This isn't just about a careless comment, it's about a man who abused his power, then hid behind a baseless lawsuit to silence the truth. As the trial wore on, Larson's polished facade began to crumble. He shifted in his seat, his broad shoulders hunching slightly, his jaw tight with unease. Every so often, his eyes darted toward Danielle, flashing with resentment. She met his stare head-on, her gaze steady and unyielding, a quiet strength radiating from her core. During a tense recess, he cornered Reed in the hallway, his voice a low hiss. "You've got to get that video tossed out." Reed's scowl deepened, his patience wearing thin. "It's too late for that, and honestly, you should have warned me how damning this would look." Larson's fists clenched, his knuckles whitening. "I didn't think she'd push back this hard," he muttered, his bravado giving way to desperation. Reed shook his head, muttering curses under his breath as he stormed off. By day's end, the courtroom buzzed with a new energy. Danielle felt it in her bones. Tide was turning. The jury's faces, once impassive, now flickered with curiosity, even skepticism. Yet she knew the video, powerful as it was, wouldn't seal the case alone. As Emily gathered their files, she turned to Danielle, her eyes alight with determination. "We've got them on the ropes now, but we need more. If we can prove this is a pattern, not a one-off, we'll bury them." Danielle nodded, a spark of resolve igniting within her. "Then let's dig deeper. There's more dirt under this rock. Can feel it." The next day, the courtroom crackled with anticipation as Emily rose, a thick stack of documents cradled in her arms. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm yet piercing, "what I'm about to share will expose a pattern of behavior that reveals Officer Larson's true character." Reed sprang up, his objection sharp and immediate. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to smear my client." The judge raised a hand, her expression stern. "Miss Turner, keep it relevant." Emily dipped her head respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor. These records are directly tied to Officer Larson's actions over the years." She turned to the jury, her gaze sweeping across their attentive faces. In 2019, a young man named Andre Williams, a college student with a spotless record, crossed paths with Officer Larson. The charge, resisting arrest. The truth, Andre was simply sitting in his car outside his dorm, minding his own business, when Larson decided he looked suspicious. A photo flashed onto the courtroom screen. Andre, a bright-eyed 19-year-old with a wide smile, his scholarship papers clutched proudly in his hands. Emily's voice softened, but her words carried weight. Andre followed every command. Yet Larson escalated things. He dragged Andre from his car, slammed him against the hood, and slapped him with a charge that didn't match reality. Reed cut in, his tone clipped. "Andre Williams has no bearing on this case." Emily whirled to face him, her eyes blazing. "It has everything to do with it. This is about a pattern, Larson, targeting young black men with no cause, again and again. This isn't a fluke, it's who he is." The judge nodded for her to proceed, and Emily pressed on. Because of Larson's lies, Andre lost his scholarship, his spot at the university, his dreams. One man's abuse of power derailed a life. The jury's expressions shifted. Some furrowed their brows, others leaned forward, hanging on every word. When Andre took the stand, the room grew quieter still. Now in his mid-20s, he carried himself with a cautious grace, his shoulders squared despite the weight of his past. He swore the oath, his voice steady, then settled into the witness chair. Emily approached, her tone gentle but firm. "Andre, tell us about your encounter with Officer Larson." He cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I was in my car, about to head to work. Officer Larson pulled up, asked for my license, said I matched some description. I handed it over, told him I wasn't involved in anything. He ordered me out. I asked why, and he just yanked me out, shoved me against the hood." "Did you resist?" Emily pressed, her voice sharpening. Andre shook his head, a flicker of old fear crossing his face. "No, I was terrified. I kept my hands up, but he claimed I was resisting, called for backup like I was some threat." Emily stepped closer. "And how did that night change your life?" Andre's jaw tightened, his eyes dropping for a moment before lifting again, resolute. "I lost my scholarship, had to drop out. Couldn't get a job with that charge on my record. It took years to clear my name, but the damage, that was permanent." A hush fell over the room, his words sinking in. "Did Larson ever explain himself, apologize?" Emily asked. Andre let out a bitter scoff. "No. To him, I was nothing, just another number." Reed rose for cross-examination, his tone brisk and dismissive. But the jury's eyes remained fixed on Andre, their faces etched with doubt. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about holding power accountable. Larson's actions, rooted in arrogance and unchecked authority, had left a trail of broken lives. And now, as the truth unfurled, the consequences of that abuse loomed large, threatening to topple the fragile tower of lies he'd built. In the dimly lit courtroom, Andre Williams sat with his shoulders squared, his dark eyes steady despite the storm brewing around him. He wasn't the type to flinch when Officer Larson had first singled him out, and not now. Under the piercing scrutiny of cross-examination, Larson hadn't acted alone that night. He'd been the spark, the one who ignited the chain of events, while the other officers trailed behind him like shadows, unquestioning and complicit. Their obedience to his lead gnawed at Andre, a bitter reminder of how power could twist truth into something unrecognizable. As Reed, the defense attorney, leaned forward with a skeptical tilt of his head, Andre felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. "So, you're telling me," Reed said, his voice smooth and probing, "that Officer Larson had some kind of personal grudge against you, a man he'd never even met before that night?" Andre's chest tightened, a flicker of frustration rising within him. He took a slow breath, letting his voice climb just enough to carry the edge of his anger. "What I'm saying," he replied, each word deliberate, "is that he spun a tale out of thin air because he had the power to do it, and no one dared to challenge him. All because of that badge pinned to his chest." Across the room, Officer Larson sat at the plaintiff's table, his broad frame rigid with tension. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the polished wood, the sound faint but insistent, like a drumbeat signaling an approaching storm. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched, betraying the calm he was desperately trying to project. Reed wrapped up his questioning, his tone clipped as he stepped back, but the damage had already seeped into the air, thick and undeniable. Larson's unease was palpable, a crack in the armor he'd worn so confidently for years. When the judge called for a recess, the room exhaled, and Larson bolted from his seat, his heavy footsteps echoing as he stormed into the hallway. Reed trailed after him, his voice low and urgent, trying to tether his client back to reason, but Larson brushed him off, his focus narrowing to a pinpoint of rage. Outside, Danielle Carter moved through the corridor with Emily Turner at her side, their conversation a quiet hum beneath the courthouse's buzz. Danielle's sharp eyes caught the flash of Larson's glare as he passed, his stare locked on Andre, who stood near the far wall, speaking with a reporter. The young man's voice was steady, recounting his story with a mix of defiance and exhaustion, his hands gesturing faintly as if tracing the weight of his words. "That kid's lying through his teeth," Larson muttered, his breath hissing between clenched teeth, venom dripping from every syllable. Danielle stopped short, her posture stiffening as she turned toward him. She felt a surge of protectiveness for Andre, a boy caught in a web not of his making. Stepping forward, she planted herself firmly in Larson's path, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Andre has no reason to lie," she said, meeting his narrowed gaze without flinching. "You, on the other hand, stand to lose everything if the truth comes out." Larson's eyes darkened, a storm cloud rolling across his features. "Watch yourself, Carter," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not." Before the tension could snap, Emily slid between them, her petite frame belying the fierceness in her stance. "Back off, Larson," she warned, her tone sharp and unyielding. "Or do you want to pile witness intimidation onto the mess you've already made?" Larson's lips curled into a sneer, and he muttered something unintelligible under his breath before turning on his heel and stalking away, his broad shoulders hunched with fury. Danielle watched him go, a flicker of unease crossing her fastenat for herself, but for what his unraveling might mean for Andre. That night, as shadows stretched across the city, Andre's voice crackled through Danielle's phone, tinged with a fear he couldn't quite mask. "Hey, Ms. Carter," he began, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I think Larson's been outside my building." Danielle sat up on her couch, the warmth of her living room suddenly feeling cold and distant. "What do you mean?" she asked, her mind already racing. Andre's breath hitched as he explained. "There's been this car parked across the street all evening. I went out to grab some groceries, and I swear I saw him in the driver's seat, just sitting there, watching. When I got back, it was gone." Danielle's heart thudded against her ribs, a mix of anger and dread flooding her senses. She gripped the phone tighter, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Andre, listen to me carefully," she said, her tone firm yet gentle. "Stay inside. Don't go anywhere alone. I'm calling the police right now to get protection for you and your family." Andre hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think he'll do something?" Danielle's mind flashed to Larson's clenched fists, his wild eyes in the hallway. "He's desperate," she said, her words heavy with certainty. "And desperate people do reckless, stupid things. But we're not going to let him scare you into silence." By morning, Danielle was a whirlwind of action. She stood in the precinct, her hands steady as she filed a formal request for police protection, detailing every unsettling move Larson had made. The officer behind the desk nodded, his brow furrowing as he scribbled notes, sensing the gravity of her words. Later, she met with Carter, the FBI agent who'd been shadowing her case, his lean frame leaning against a desk cluttered with files. She recounted the previous night's events, her voice low but urgent, and Carter's expression darkened. "Larson's crossing lines he can't uncross," he said. His tone clipped. "If he's stalking witnesses, this isn't just desperation, it's a blatant attempt to bury the truth. We can't let him slip through the cracks." Danielle nodded, her resolve hardening. "Andre's testimony is our cornerstone," she said. "If Larson silences him, justice goes down with it." When the trial resumed, the courtroom felt smaller, the air thick with anticipation. Larson sat at the plaintiff's table, but the arrogance that once defined him had eroded, replaced by a simmering frustration that radiated from his tense frame. His eyes darted toward the jury, searching their faces for doubt, but finding only scrutiny. Emily seized the moment, stepping forward with a fire in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice ringing clear and commanding. "What you've witnessed here isn't an isolated mistake. It's a pattern of deliberate abuse of power. Officer Larson has preyed on people like Andre Williams time and again, hiding behind his badge like it's a shield. But today, that shield is cracking, and the truth is spilling out." Larson's hand slammed down on the table, the sharp crack slicing through her words. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, his voice raw with defiance. The judge's gavel crashed down, a thunderclap of authority. "Officer Larson, control yourself," the judge snapped, "or I'll hold you in contempt." Reed grabbed Larson's shoulder, whispering fiercely in his ear, and after a tense moment, Larson sank back into his seat, his face flushed a deep crimson, his chest heaving. The outburst only fueled Danielle's suspicions. Larson was coming apart at the seams, and that made him unpredictable dangers. She exchanged a glance with Emily, both of them silently acknowledging the tightrope they walked. Justice hung in the balance, but so did Andre's safety, and they couldn't afford a misstep. Then came the call to the stand. Officer Anthony Delgado, Larson's attorney, announced, his voice booming through the room. Delgado, Larson's partner of 5 years, strode forward, his movements precise, his tie tugged straight as he settled into the witness box. His face was a mask of neutrality, but his eyes flickered with something unreadable. Emily leaned toward Danielle, her breath warm against her ear. "Keep your eyes on him," she murmured. "Delgado's holding more cards than he's showing." Danielle nodded, her gaze locking onto the man now swearing his oath, her instincts humming. Reed started easy, his tone almost chummy. "Officer Delgado, how long have you worked with Officer Larson?" he asked, pacing slowly. 5 years. Delgado replied, his voice flat, practiced. "And in that time, would you say he's been a reliable, professional officer?" Reed pressed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Absolutely," Delgado said, not missing a beat. Reed's smile widened. "Can you tell us about the night Officer Larson encountered Ms. Carter? Were you there?" Delgado nodded, his posture stiffening slightly. "Yes, I was. And what did you see?" Reed asked, his tone coaxing. Delgado paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw every eye. "Ms. Carter was uncooperative," he said, his voice steady. "She kept questioning Officer Larson, refusing to follow his instructions." Reed feigned surprise, his brows lifting. Refused? Yes, Delgado confirmed, doubling down. She got confrontational. And that's what escalated things. Reed turned to the jury with a satisfied nod. Thank you, Officer Delgado. No further questions. Emily rose, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the stand. Her presence commanding. Officer Delgado, she began, her voice cutting through the room's hum. You say, Ms. Carter was uncooperative. Can you be specific? How exactly did she refuse to comply? Delgado shifted in his seat, a subtle crack in his composure. She kept asking why she was being stopped, he said, his tone tightening. Emily tilted her head, her expression probing. And that's uncooperative, asking why. Delgado's eyes flicked away briefly before returning. It was her tone, he added quickly, grasping for footing. Emily's eyebrow arched, her voice sharpening. Her tone, was she yelling, threatening you or Officer Larson? Delgado's jaw tightened. No, he admitted, the word grudging, but she was challenging our authority. Emily's gaze bore into him. Challenging your authority or questioning why she, a black woman legally parked in her own car, was being treated like a criminal. Delgado stiffened, his fingers curling slightly. She matched a suspect description we were looking for, he said, his voice flat. Emily pounced. And did you later confirm she had no connection to that suspect? Delgado's reluctance was a weight in the air. Yes, he said finally, barely audible. So she was innocent, Emily declared, her voice rising. And still, she was cited, searched, harassed. Tell me, Officer Delgado, is that standard procedure? He hesitated, his silence a chasm. Emily didn't relent. Let's dig deeper, she said, her tone turning cold. In your 5 years with Officer Larson, have you ever seen him use excessive force or act unprofessionally? Delgado's response was swift, almost rehearsed. No. Emily held up a stack of papers, her eyes glinting. Then how do you explain to Seath multiple complaints filed against him over the years? Complaints you were copied on as his partner. Reed shot to his feet. Objection irrelevant. Emily didn't flinch. It goes straight to this witness's credibility and the plaintiff's, Your Honor. The judge paused, then waved a hand, overruled. Proceed. Emily stepped closer, her voice unrelenting. I'll ask again, Officer Delgado. Are you telling this court you never saw Officer Larson act improperly? Despite all these documented complaints, Delgado's jaw locked, his eyes narrowing. I can't speak to those complaints, he said tersely. But you knew about them, Emily pressed, her words a blade. Yes, he admitted, the confession slipping out like a stone dropping into still water. The room held its breath, the weight of Delgado's words sinking in. Danielle watched, her mind churning. Larson's power had corrupted more than just him, it had tainted everyone around him, pulling them into a web of silence and complicity. But now, that web was fraying, and with it, the illusion of invincibility. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. She realized that it was about dismantling the systems that let them thrive. And as Delgado squirmed under Emily's gaze, Danielle felt a spark of hope. The truth was clawing its way free, and no badge could bury it forever. In the dimly lit courtroom, Emily's voice cut through the tense air, steady and resolute despite the weight of the moment. Thank you, Officer Delgado, she said, her words ringing with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. Her gratitude wasn't just polite, it was a deliberate anchor, grounding the exchange in the gravity of what had just unfolded. Delgado, seated at the witness stand, barely managed a nod, his throat tight, his voice so faint it seemed to dissolve into the hum of the room. During a brief recess, Danielle slipped out into the hallway, craving a moment of stillness after the morning's relentless pace. The air outside the courtroom felt cooler, sharper, but her reprieve was short-lived. As she turned a corner, the muffled sound of raised voices pricked her ears in argument. Ron unguarded, spilling from just beyond her sight. Curiosity tugged at her, and she stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. There, in the shadowed alcove, stood Larson, his face a storm of red fury, his broad frame looming over Delgado. The two men were locked in a confrontation, so charged it seemed the air itself might ignite. Larson's finger jabbed into Delgado's chest, a sharp, accusing thrust. You're hanging me out to dry, he hissed, his voice low and venomous, each syllable dripping with betrayal. Delgado, smaller but unyielding, raised his hands in a gesture of defense, palms open as if to push back the weight of Larson's rage. "I said what I had to say," he replied, his tone steady but threaded with exhaustion. "I'm not going to lie under oath for Yennet to save your skin." Larson's eyes narrowed, his breath coming in short, furious bursts. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a guttural growl that sent a shiver down Danielle's spine. Even from where she stood, "You think they won't come for you next? You're in this as deep as I am." Delgado shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of resignation. "No, Greg, this is your mess. You've always pushed to far-crossed lines I never wanted to touch." His words hung there, heavy with the unspoken history between them, a partnership frayed by years of compromise and unspoken tension. Before Larson could fire back, Danielle made her presence known, stepping into the light with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked, her voice cool and cutting. Both men froze, their bodies stiffening as if caught in a spotlight. The air thickened with their unspoken panic, the tension so palpable Danielle could almost feel it pressing against her skin. Larson's glare swung toward her, dark and searing. "Stay out of this, Carter," he snapped, his words a jagged warning. But Danielle didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, her stance unwavering, her eyes locked on his. "Hard to stay out of it when it's my case you're trying to bully your way through." Her tone was sharp, laced with a defiance that dared him to push her further. Larson's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides, but he said nothing more. With a final, venomous look, he stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the hall like the retreat of a wounded animal. Delgado remained, rooted to the spot, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and shaken. He avoided Danielle's gaze, but she could see the cracks forming: fear, guilt, and something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. Back in the courtroom, Emily seized the moment to shift the tide. She stood before the jury, her posture commanding, her voice clear as she introduced a new piece of evidence: seeding emails exchanged between Larson and Delgado. "These communications," she explained, her words deliberate and unflinching, "reveal a pattern of behavior. Officer Larson didn't just enforce the law, twisted it, directing his team to escalate minor incidents, to target people based on their race or their lack of means." She paused, letting the weight of her accusation settle over the room. Reed, Larson's attorney, leapt to his feet, his voice tight with strain. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to vilify my client irrelevant to the charges at hand." But the judge, perched high on the bench, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "If these emails establish a consistent pattern tied to the defendant's actions, they're admissible." Overruled, his ruling landed like a gavel, sharp and final. Emily wasted no time. She projected one email onto the courtroom screen, its stark black text glaring against the white background. Larson's words leapt out. "Another one of these troublemakersalts, make an example out of him." The jury's reaction was electric. Gasps rippled through the rows, eyes widened in disbelief, and murmurs buzzed like static. Faces that had been neutral now hardened with shock, their trust in the badge visibly fraying. Emily turned back to Delgado, her gaze piercing. "Officer Delgado, did you ever report these orders? Did you ever push back?" Delgado stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his voice barely a whisper. "No." Emily stepped closer, her tone insistent, almost pleading. "And why not?" The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, until Delgado finally spoke, his admission raw and halting. "Because I didn't think it'd matter." Larson had people connections. Complaints against him just vanished. His shoulders sagged further, as if the weight of his own words crushed him. By the end of Delgado's testimony, Larson's mask of confidence had begun to crumble. He sat at the defense table, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, his eyes darting toward Delgado with a hatred so fierce it seemed to burn through the air between them. The man who had once strode through the precinct with unshakable swagger was unraveling, thread by thread, before the jury's eyes. As the day drew to a close, Danielle and Emily retreated to a small, private room off the courthouse. the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound breaking the silence. Emily paced, her movements sharp and restless. "He's losing it," she said, her voice edged with a fierce satisfaction. Delgado broke under the pressure, and the jury saw it all, every crack, every lie. Danielle nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "Larson's desperate now. We've got him cornered, but that makes him unpredictable. We need to brace ourselves for whatever he throws at us next." The turning point had come. But Danielle knew desperation could sharpen a man's claws, make him lash out in ways they couldn't yet foresee. Later that night, Danielle sat alone in her office, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the scattered notes and legal pads. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but sleep felt like a distant luxury. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts, and the name flashing on the screen, James Carter, sent a surge of adrenaline through her. She answered, her voice clipped and urgent. "Tell me you've got something." Carter's response came low and grim, heavy with the weight of discovery. "More than something, Danielle. We've been digging into Larson's tease. It's bigger than we ever imagined." She straightened in her chair, her focus narrowing to a razor's edge. "How big?" Carter exhaled, the sound crackling through the line. "Larson's part of a network, a web of officers, high-ranking, spread across multiple precincts. They've been shielding each other for years. Complaints vanish, evidence gets buried. This isn't just misconduct, it's corruption, baked into the system." Danielle's grip on the phone tightened, her knuckles paling. "Do we have names?" she pressed. "We're piecing it together," Carter replied. "Larson's not the one calling the shots, as a cog, a pawn. The real power's higher up, someone pulling strings from the shadows, a benefactor keeping their hands spotless." Her jaw clenched, a slow burn of anger rising in her chest. "And Larson knows who it is." "Exactly," Carter confirmed. "He's scared, cornered, but if we push too hard, he might clam up. Or worse, he'll strike back." The warning lingered, cold and ominous. That night, as Danielle crossed the courthouse parking lot to her car, the air felt thick with unease. She stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. Their tires were slashed, jagged gashes tearing through the rubber, and the rear window lay in shards across the asphalt. The message was unmistakable, a silent scream of intimidation. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to skin the darkness, every rustle of wind sharpening her senses. Her phone vibrated in her hand, and she glanced down to see a text from an unknown number. "Don't dig too deep. If you value your safety." Fear clawed at her, but she swallowed it down. Her resolve hardening, she snapped photos of the wreckage, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest, and sent them to Carter with a terse message. "They're trying to scare me." "It won't work." His reply flashed back instantly. "We'll tighten security. Stay sharp." Meanwhile, across town, Larson's unraveling reached a fever pitch. He stormed into the precinct locker room, his boots slamming against the tile, and drove his fist into a row of metal lockers with a resounding clang. The sound reverberated, drawing wary glances from the handful of officers lingering nearby. "Don't just stand there," he bellowed, his voice ragged with frustration. "You all know what's happening. Carter's coming for us, and you're letting her." A veteran officer named Miller stepped forward, his weathered face etched with caution. "Greg, maybe it's time to let this go. The harder you push, the more you're pulling us all down with you." Larson's eyes blazed, his lips curling into a snarl. "Let it go. You think she'll stop with me? She's after all of us." Miller hesitated, glancing at the others, their silence a wall of unease. "Not everyone's willing to risk their neck for you, Larson. You're on your own road now." Larson's face twisted with fury. "Cowards," he spat, slamming the door as he stormed out, leaving a fractured stillness in his wake. The next morning, Danielle, Carter, and Emily convened in a secure conference room, the air thick with purpose. Carter spread a series of files and charts across the table, his finger jabbing at a tangled web of names and lines. "This is what we've uncovered," he began, his voice steady but urgent. "Larson's tied to at least 5 officers across 3 precincts, with records of complaints." That vanished into thin air. Emily's eyes scanned the diagram, her expression darkening. "And the benefactor?" Carter shook his head. "Still a ghost. They're meticulous, working through layers to stay clean." Danielle leaned in, her mind racing. "Larson's our key. He's cracking if we press him just right. He'll give us a name. Carter nodded. Agreed. But we move fast. Whoever smashed your car knows we're closing in. They're not going to wait. That afternoon, Danielle cornered Larson in the courthouse hallway. He was slouched against the wall, scrolling his phone with a distracted air. But he snapped upright as she approached, his eyes narrowing. "You look rough, Larson," she said, her tone biting. "Trouble sleeping." His glare was a blade, sharp and cold. "What do you want, Carter?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "The truth. I know you're tangled up in something bigger. Spill it, or I'll keep digging until there's nothing left to hide." His silence was a wall, but the flicker of fear in his eyes told her everything was close, and he knew it. The lesson here stretched beyond the courtroom, weaving through every heated exchange and shattered illusion. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a reckoning, a slow grind that exposed the rot beneath polished badges and hollow oaths. Larson's fall wasn't merely personal, it was a mirror held up to a system warped by power, where the consequences of abuse rippled outward, ensnaring the guilty and the complicit alike. Delgado's quiet shame, Miller's reluctant defiance, Carter's grim resalvial underscored a truth as old as time. When power festers unchecked, it devours everything, leaving only the brave or the broken to pick up the pieces. The world Larson had so carefully built was collapsing, its jagged edges pressing in closer with every passing moment. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, a suffocating tightness that refused to relent. His jaw clenched hard enough to ache as he stood in the dim light of the precinct locker room, the air thick with the stale scent of sweat and metal. Danielle's words still echoed in his mind, sharp and unrelenting, like a blade slicing through the fragile threads of his composure. "You're the weak link, Greg," she'd said, her voice dripping with a certainty that gnawed at him. "How long do you think they'll protect you when it all comes crashing down?" He'd tried to dismiss her, his teeth grinding as he spat back. "You don't know what you're talking about." But deep down, Larson knew she was right. The threats had been piling up, whispered warnings from shadowed corners, cold glances from people he'd once called allies. Danielle had seen it all, her hazel eyes glinting with a mix of triumph and pity as she leaned closer, her tone cutting deeper than any shout. "The intimidation, the crumbling alley and Sussex unraveling, Greg. And if you don't start talking, you'll be the one left with nothing but the wreckage." Her smirk lingered in the air like a taunt as she turned on her heel, her boots clicking against the tiled floor, leaving him alone with the storm brewing inside him. Larson's hands curled into fists, the knuckles whitening as he fought the urge to lash out. He wanted to scream, to prove her wrong, but the silence swallowed him instead. That night, as the precinct hummed faintly with the distant clatter of keyboards and muffled voices, his phone buzzed. It was Carter, his voice low and clipped through the speaker. "We've got more threads in the web, Danielle," he said, the exhaustion in his tone betraying the hours he'd spent digging. "These people, they've got their hands in everything. Fake evidence, hush money, you name it. It's a damn machine." Danielle, sitting in her cramped apartment with a cup of cold coffee in hand, pressed the phone tighter to her ear. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments Carter laid out. "Any sign of the big fish?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flicker of unease in her gut. Carter sighed, a sound heavy with frustration. "Not yet, but we're getting closer. Whoever is bankrolling this has money to burn and connections that run deep. This isn't going to be a walk in the park." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, her resolve hardening like steel. "Nothing worth doing ever is," she replied, her words a quiet vow to herself as much as to him. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Larson's world was shrinking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face as he paced the empty hallway. He needed Simeone and Yodo tell him he wasn't as alone as he felt. Officer Bradley had been his rock, a gruff man with a quick laugh and a loyalty Larson had never doubted. But now, as he cornered Bradley near the coffee machine, desperation seeped into his voice. "They're closing in, Brad," he said, his throat tight. "You've got to have my back on this." Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his broad shoulders hunching as he avoided Larson's pleading gaze. The steam from his coffee curled upward, a fleeting distraction from the tension between them. "Greg," he started, his voice low and strained. "This isn't just about you anymore. This mess, it's bigger than us. I've got a wife, kids. I can't risk everything." Larson's eyes widened, a flash of betrayal cutting through him like ice. "So that's it. You're bailing on me." His voice cracked, raw with disbelief. Bradley hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug until his knuckles paled. "I'm saying you need to sort this out yourself. The walls are closing in, man. Don't pull me under with you." He turned away, his footsteps heavy as he retreated down the hall, leaving Larson alone with the bitter sting of abandonment. Rage surged through him, hot and blinding. He spun and drove his fist into a locker, the metallic clang reverberating through the empty space, a hollow cry of a man watching his foundation crumble. Danielle, on the other hand, felt the tide shifting in her favor. She sat across from Emily in a cluttered office, papers strewn across the desk like a battlefield map, the latest evidencia stack of intercepted messages and dubious bank transfers between them. Glowing with promise, "We've got him on the ropes," Emily said, her voice bright with cautious optimism. She was younger than Danielle, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, but her sharp mind had already proven invaluable. Danielle tapped a finger against the table, her brow furrowing. "Not quite. A cornered animal fights hardest, Em. We need to be ready for whatever he throws at us." The unraveling of Larson's network was a beacon, a sign that the rot ran deeper than any of them had imagined. But Danielle's sights were set higher, the puppet master orchestrating it all. Later that day, Carter summoned her to his office, the urgency in his call prickling her skin. She stepped inside, the faint scent of old leather and cigarette smoke greeting her as he slid a thick manila folder across his desk. "We've got a name," he said, his voice a low rumble. Danielle's fingers brushed the worn edges of the file as she opened it, revealing a photograph of a man with a steely gaze and a suit that screamed wealth. Beneath it, in bold letters, "Edward Thorne." "Thorne," she repeated, the name tasting sharp on her tongue as she scanned the dossier. Carter nodded, leaning back in his chair, the springs creaking under his weight. "Businessman. Political ties out the wazoo, a trail of shady deals long enough to wrap around the city twice. He's got the cash and the clout to bury anyone who gets in his way. He's the one holding Larson's leash." Danielle's eyes narrowed, her pulse quickening as she flipped through pages of financial records, offshore accounts, dummy corporations, payments to silence the inconvenient. "This is big," she murmured, her mind already racing ahead. "It's a start," Carter cautioned, pointing to a column of numbers. "Thorne's smart. These transactions don't tie him to Larson direct. Everything's funneled through middlemen. We need concrete proof, something that sticks." Danielle met his gaze, her determination blazing. "Then we keep digging. We don't stop until he's exposed." That evening, as she drove home through the quiet streets, the city's pulse seemed to slow. Her car sliced through pools of amber light cast by flickering street lamps, the hum of the engine a steady companion to her swirling thoughts. Edward Thorne loomed large in her mind, a shadow stretching far beyond Larson's petty corruption. She turned onto a quieter road, the buildings thinning out, when a pair of headlights flared in her rearview mirror. At first, she brushed at a fan of their late-night driver, nothing more. But after 3 deliberate turns, the car was still there, a persistent shadow trailing her every move. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles paling as she tested the waters. Easing off the gas, the car didn't pass. Instead, it surged closer, its presence a silent threat. "All right," she muttered under her breath, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. "Let's see what you've got." She jerked the wheel hard, veering into a maze of residential streets, the tires squealing against the asphalt. The headlights followed, unrelenting, cutting through the darkness like a predator's eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind stayed razor-sharp. She snatched her phone from the passenger's seat, dialing 911 with practiced calm. "This is Danielle Carter," she said, her voice steady as she rattled off her location. "I'm being followed by a suspicious vehicle." The dispatcher's voice crackled through. "Calm and professional. Stay on the line. Units are en route." The car behind her lunged forward, pulling alongside her, tinted windows at the driver's face. But the intent was clear as it swerved, forcing her to wrench the wheel to avoid a crash. "Not today," she growled, flooring the accelerator. Her car shot forward, tires screaming as she swung onto a main road, weaving through sparse traffic. The pursuing vehicle faltered, struggling to match her pace. Up ahead, the red and blue flash of a police cruiser pierced the night, and the shadow car braked hard, peeling off in a sharp U-turn. Danielle pulled over, her breaths coming fast and shallow as two officers approached, their flashlights bobbing in the dark. "You okay, Mum?" one asked, his voice gruff but kind. She flashed her badge, her composure returning. "I'm fine. Didn't see the driver to dark. Tinted windows, but they didn't want me poking around. That much I know." The officers exchanged a glance, jotting down her statement as she steadied herself, the adrenaline still buzzing in her veins. The next morning, she debriefed with Carter, the encounter fueling her fire. "They're getting reckless," he said, his brow creased with concern. "Thorne's trying to rattle me," she replied, her jaw set. "It's not going to work. If anything, this tells me we're hitting a nerve." Carter nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Agreed. But we've got to play this smart. Thorne's got the means to erase problems permanently. If he has to, then we strike at his core," Danielle said, her voice ringing with conviction. "His image, his influence. We show the world that no one's above the law, not even Edward Thorne." That afternoon, she and Carter huddled with Emily, plotting their next move. "Thorne's built a fortress out of his reputation," Emily said, her fingers tracing a news clipping of him smiling at a charity gala. "Philanthropist. Community hero, people eat it up. If we want to take him down, we've got to shatter that mask." Danielle tapped the financial records. "These are our foothold. We need something undeniable, proof that ties him straight to Larson's dirty work." Carter leaned in, his voice firm. "Surveillance is on his inner circle. One of them might slip, and we're pushing for subpoenas on his private accounts south. His lawyers will fight us tooth and nail." Emily's eyes gleamed with determination. "Then we fight dirtier." As they spoke, Carter's phone buzzed, a new lead lighting up the screen. He held up a grainy photo of a warehouse, its weathered walls cloaked in dusk. "Movement at one of Thorne's properties," he said, his tone electric. "Secluded spot. Outskirts of town. Could be nothing or it could be everything." Danielle's gaze locked on the image, a thrill coursing through her. The hunt was on, and with every step, the lesson grew clearer. Justice wasn't just a goal, it was a reckoning. Power, when twisted and abused, left a trail of consequences, and she'd follow it to the end, no matter the cost. In the heart of a restless city, whispers swirled that a shadowy enclave had become the clandestine gathering spot for a powerful inner circle. Danielle Carter, a seasoned investigator with a fire in her veins, stood in the dimly lit operations room, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the latest intelligence. The air was thick with tension, the hum of flickering monitors casting jagged shadows across her face. "Do we have enough to strike?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the haze of uncertainty. Carter, her trusted partner, leaned against a cluttered desk, his brow furrowed with the weight of their predicament. "Not yet," he admitted, his tone heavy with reluctance. "But if we could slip someone inside their ranks, we might finally unearth the proof we've been chasing." Danielle's jaw tightened, a spark of determination igniting in her chest. "Then let's make it happen," she said, her words a quiet vow to see justice served, no matter the cost. That night, Danielle trudged back to her modest apartment, the city's neon glow seeping through her blinds as she locked the door behind her. Her mind churned relentlessly, a storm of thoughts battering her resolve. The case had grown into a beast, its tentacles wrapping tighter around her with every passing day. She sank onto her worn couch, the silence of the room amplifying the pressure that gnawed at her soul. Suddenly, her phone jolted to life, buzzing against the coffee table like an angry hornet. Another anonymous message glared up at her. "Last warning. Walk away." Her breath caught, her fingers trembling slightly as she stared at the screen. Fear flickered in her gut, but it was quickly overtaken by a steely resolve. Whoever was behind these threats had misjudged her. They thought she'd crumble, but they didn't know the fire that burned within her. She forwarded the message to Carter, her note curt and unflinching. "They're scared. So am I. Let's end this." The revelation that Edward Thorne, a titan of wealth and influence, Was the mastermind funding this web of corruption sent shockwaves through their investigation? Danielle felt the gravity of it settle into her bones. This wasn't just a takedown. It was a war against a man who'd spent decades cloaking himself in power. Untouchable and unrepentant, she knew confronting him would be their most perilous fight yet. A battle where justice hung in the balance, and the consequences of failure loomed like a guillotine. Under a moonless sky, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs glided silently along a winding, tree-lined road, their tires whispering against the asphalt as they approached Thorne's sprawling estate. Inside the lead vehicle, Carter's voice was a steady drumbeat as he briefed his team one final time. "Thorne's security is private, well-armed, and fiercely loyal," he warned, his eyes scanning the tense faces around him. "Expect resistance the moment we cross that threshold. Our mission is clear: secure him and any damning evidence. No slip-ups." His words were clipped, a commander steeling his soldiers for the chaos ahead. Danielle sat in the back seat, her fingers brushing over her earpiece as she checked its connection, her heart pounding a relentless rhythm against her ribs. "What about Thorne himself?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. Carter glanced back, his expression grim. "He'll try to talk his way out smooth and slippery as ever. Don't let him. This is a man who's hid behind his wealth and influence for years. It's time he faces the cold, hard truth." The convoy halted a few hundred feet from the estate's imposing iron gate, the night swallowing them in its inky embrace. Carter's voice crackled through their comms. "Positions. Move in." The first team slunk forward under the cover of darkness, their silhouettes blending into the shadows. A pair of bolt cutters gleamed briefly as they snapped the thick chain binding the gate, the metallic clank swallowed by the stillness. As the agents slipped through, the estate erupted into blinding light. Floodlights blazed to life, painting the driveway in a harsh, artificial glow. A loudspeaker crackled, its voice booming with menace. "This is private property. Turn back now, or face the consequences." Danielle's pulse quickened, her grip tightening on her weapon. "Go loud," Carter ordered, his command unleashing a storm. The agents surged forward, splitting into agile units as gunfire erupted from the estate's upper balconies. Bullets rained down, spitting sparks where they struck the ground. Danielle dove behind a stone pillar near the front entrance, her breath ragged as projectiles ricocheted off the concrete inches from her head. Beside her, a young Agent Harris, his face pale but determined, returned fire, his shots forcing the guards to duck back into the shadows. "Clear the balconies," Carter's voice roared through the comms, and a team of snipers slithered into position, their scopes glinting faintly. One by one, the guards fell silent, their resistance snuffed out in a matter of minutes. "Move in," Carter barked, and Danielle surged forward with the main team. A battering ram crashed against the estate's heavy oak doors, splintering them open with a thunderous groan. Inside, the mansion unfurled like a gilded maze. Marble floors gleamed under chandeliers. Grand staircases spiraled upward, and priceless artwork adorned the walls. A testament to Thorne's ill-gotten empire. Agents fanned out, their boots echoing as they swept each room with methodical precision. "Third floor, west wing," an agent's voice crackled over the comms, urgent and sharp. Danielle and Carter bolted upstairs, weapons drawn, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpet lining the corridor. At its end stood Edward Thorne, framed by the opulence of his lavish study. Two burly bodyguards flanked him, their hands hovering near holstered guns. Thorne raised his hands in a theatrical gesture of surrender, a smug smile curling his lips. "Gentlemen and Miss Carter," he drawled, his voice smooth as velvet. "You could have just knocked." "Step away from your guards," Carter ordered, his tone unyielding. Thorne didn't budge, his eyes glinting with arrogance. "Do you even realize who you're tangling with, or the chaos you're about to unleash?" Danielle stepped forward, her weapon steady, her gaze piercing through his forehead. "Save the theatrics, Thorne. Your empire's collapsing, and you feel it slipping through your fingers." He chuckled, a low, mocking sound that grated against her nerves. "My dear, you think this is about me. I'm merely a cog in a grander machine, a facilitator. If you will." The air in the room crackled with tension, electric and suffocating. Danielle's voice cut through it like a blade. You've built a network that's shattered countless lives. You're not slithering out of this." Thorne's smirk widened as he lowered his hands, defiant. "You still don't see it. Taking me down changes nothing. The system you're so eager to mend, it's rotten to the core rigged from the start. Men like me, we're untouchable. Not tonight." Carter snapped, his patience fraying. "Cuff him." An agent lunged forward, snapping handcuffs onto Thorne's wrists with a satisfying click. His bodyguards, disarmed in a swift, coordinated takedown, glowered helplessly as they were restrained. As the agents began tearing through the study, Danielle's eyes caught on a sleek black safe tucked behind a gaudy painting. She waved over an evidence tech, a weary man named Jenkins, whose hands trembled slightly with anticipation. "Get this open," she said, her voice low but firm. "Whatever's inside could be the key to unraveling this whole mess." Minutes later, the safe yielded its secret stacks of documents, hard drives, and a handful of passports bearing aliases sprawled across the table. Danielle plucked a hard drive from the pile, turning it over in her hands. Its cold weight a promise of truth. "This is it," she murmured, a flicker of triumph breaking through her exhaustion. "The proof we need." As Thorne was marched out of the estate, a swarm of journalists and camera crews had amassed beyond the gates, their flashes slicing through the night like lightning. Thorne straightened his tailored suit as best he could, his handcuffs clinking faintly, and flashed a practiced smile. "Mr. Thorne, any comment?" a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone toward him. He paused, turning to face the cameras with the poise of a man still clinging to control. "I have nothing to hide," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "This is a misunderstanding, nothing more. The truth will surface soon enough." Danielle emerged from the estate, her eyes locking with Thorne's across the chaotic scene. He leaned slightly toward her, his smirk returning as he whispered, "This isn't over, Miss Carter. You've just painted a target on your back." She didn't flinch, her stare unwavering. "You're the one in cuffs, Thorne. The only target here is you." He was shoved into an FBI vehicle, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the night. Back at the FBI field office, Danielle and Carter hunched over a conference table strewn with evidence from the raid. The documents unveiled a sprawling tapestry of corruption financial transactions, linking dozens of high-ranking officials, law enforcement officers, and corporate titans. Carter's fingers traced a line of names, his voice grim. "This is bigger than we imagined." Danielle nodded, her exhaustion mingling with a fierce determination. Thorne wasn't bluffing about being part of something larger. "But that doesn't mean we back down." Carter leaned back, rubbing his temples. "No, it doesn't. But now we've rattled their cage. They'll come for us with everything they've got." Danielle's expression hardened, her resolve a fortress against the storm ahead. "Let them. We're ready." Days later, the courtroom buzzed with a different kind of tension as Greg Larson, a disgraced officer caught in Thorne's web, took the stand. His attorney, Charles Reed, paced before him, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Reed's voice was calm, measured, weaving a tale of victimhood. "Officer Larson, this ordeal has turned your life upside down, hasn't it?" Larson nodded, his face a mask of feigned vulnerability, though his eyes darted nervously toward the jury. "It has," he said, his voice trembling just enough to sell the act. "I've been painted as a villain for simply doing my job. My family, my reputation, it's all been torn apart." Reed pivoted to the jury, his hands gesturing emphatically. "This man has served his community with dedication for years, and now baseless accusations have dragged him through the dirt." Larson leaned forward, his voice soft but calculated as he addressed the jurors directly. "I've always been professional. Yes, my encounter with Miss Carter was heated, but only because she came at me with hostility. I didn't target Harry, didn't do anything wrong." Danielle sat at the defense table, her posture composed, her face a study in quiet intensity. Inside, her emotions churned a mix of anger at Larson's lies and a deep, unshakable belief in the justice she fought for. Across the room, Emily Turner, a junior agent who'd been shadowing Danielle, watched with wide eyes, her admiration for her mentor warring with the fear of what this trial might unleash. The lesson was clear. Power, when abused, built empires on the backs of the innocent. But just as relentless and unflinching could topple even the mightiest. Thorne and Larson thought themselves invincible, but their downfall proved that no one was above the consequences of their actions. For Danielle, this was more than a case, it was a reckoning, a testament to the truth that corruption might bend the world, but it could never break those who stood against it. In the dimly lit courtroom, whispers fluttered like restless moths as Danielle leaned toward her companion, her voice a soft hiss against the hum of anticipation. "They're buying it," she murmured, her sharp eyes scanning the jury's face, each one a canvas of furrowed brows and tight lips. Beside her, Emily gave a subtle nod, her expression cool but resolute. "Not for long," she replied, her tone carrying a quiet promise, like the calm before a storm breaks. The air thickened as Emily rose from her seat, her heels clicking against the polished floor with a rhythm that seemed to demand attention. The atmosphere shifted instantly electric, taut, as if the room itself held its breath. She turned her gaze toward Officer Greg Larson, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, precise and unrelenting. "Officer Larson," she began, each syllable deliberate, "you insist you were simply doing your job. So tell me, does that job description include handing out baseless citations and subjecting people to rough, unwarranted searches?" Larson stiffened in the witness stand, his broad shoulders squaring as if to shield himself from the weight of her words. His jaw clenched, and a faint flush crept up his neck, betraying the cracks in his composure. "I acted within protocol," he said, his voice gruff, though it wavered just enough to hint at the unease simmering beneath his defiance. Emily's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile as she paced toward the jury, her movements fluid yet purposeful. "Protocol," she echoed, letting the word hang in the air like an accusation. "Let's talk about your protocol." She lifted a small remote, and the screen behind her flickered to life, casting a harsh glow across the room. The body cam footage rolled grainy, but damning, showing Larson towering over a trembling woman, his tone dripping with contempt as he barked derogatory remarks and slapped a citation into her shaking hands. "This," Emily said, gesturing to the screen, "shows you escalating a routine stop into a personal vendetta. You mocked her, humiliated her, and handed her a ticket with no basis. Is that protocol?" Larson squirmed, his fingers twitching against the wooden edge of the stand. "The video doesn't show everything," he muttered, his eyes darting toward his lawyer, Reed, who sat rigid at the defense table. Emily tilted her head, her expression a mix of curiosity and challenge. "Oh, then let's fill in the blanks," she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "How about the 5 prior complaints lodged against you for nearly identical behavior? 5 separate incidents of different voices claiming you abused your power. Were those just misunderstandings, Officer Larson?" Reed shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Objection, irrelevant," he snapped, his voice booming across the room. The judge, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair, leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Overruled," she said coolly. "The jury will decide what's relevant." A ripple of murmurs spread through the spectators as Emily turned back to Larson, her eyes locking onto his. "Let's get to the point," she said, stepping closer, her presence commanding. "Isn't it true that you've targeted people, specifically people of color, over and over again, using your badge as a shield to dodge accountability?" Larson's face darkened, his lips parting as if to protest, but the words caught in his throat. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple. "That's not true," he managed, though his voice trembled, thin and unconvincing. Emily advanced, relentless. "So you're telling us that all those complaints, this footage, and the financial records tying you to payouts from Edward Thorne's network, they're all just coincidences?" His mouth opened, then closed, a fish gasping for air. Emily's voice rose, sharp and resonant, filling the room. "Officer Larson, isn't it true that you've wielded your authority like a weapon, intimidating and silencing anyone who dared to push back? And when Danielle Carter refused to bow, you filed this lawsuit to bury your guilt under a pile of lies?" His hands gripped the stand so tightly his knuckles blanched, his carefully constructed mask splintering. "Yes or no, Officer Larson?" she pressed, her stare unyielding. He flicked a desperate glance toward Reed, who stared at the table, offering no lifeline. "2 was just following orders," Larson stammered, his voice barely audible. The courtroom erupted into a chorus of gasps and whispers, the air buzzing with the revelation. Emily paused, letting his confession settle over the jury like a heavy fog. She turned to them, her tone softening but no less powerful. "You've heard it straight from him," she said, gesturing toward Larson's slumped figure. "This isn't about one mistake, it's a pattern. A sickness of abuse woven into a network that's protected him for far too long. Today, you hold the power to say enough." As the jury filed out to deliberate, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving a hollow echo behind. Danielle lingered in the hallway, standing by the water cooler, its phantom a stark contrast to the chaos buzzing through her phone. Updates from Carter flooded her screen, each ping tightening the knot in her chest. Larson's on edge. Carter's voice crackled over the line, low and urgent. "If we push harder, he might slip up." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind racing. "Good," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning within her. "Let him." Hours later, the jury returned, their faces a mix of exhaustion and resolve. The foreperson, a weary man with glasses perched on his nose, stood, the verdict trembling in his grip. "In the matter of Larson versus Carter," he read, his voice shaking slightly, "we find in favor of the defendant, Danielle Carter." A collective sigh swept through the room, a release of tension that had coiled tighter with every passing minute. Danielle sat motionless, her posture impeccable, though a fleeting glimmer of relief softened her eyes. Across the room, Larson froze, his face drained of color, his hands quivering like leaves in a gale. As the crowd dispersed, he slipped away from Reed's side, vanishing into the sea of bodies. Danielle noticed the empty space where he'd been and grabbed her phone. "Larson's gone," she said, her voice tight with urgency as she dialed Carter. "Check the airports." Carter's response was immediate, calm but firm. "We're already on it." Under the sterile lights of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, Larson darted through the terminal, a baseball cap tugged low over his brow. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat urging him forward as he clutched a one-way ticket to Freedoma country. Beyond the reach of extradition, the gate loomed ahead, a beacon of escape. But as he quickened his pace, two figures stepped into his path: be agents, their badges glinting like cold steel. "Greg Larson," one said, his voice flat and final, "you're under arrest." Panic flared in Larson's eyes, and he lunged to the side, desperate to break free. But a third agent emerged from the shadows, seizing his arm with an iron grip. "This isn't over," Larson shouted, his voice raw with defiance as the cuffs snapped around his wrists. "You don't know who you're messing with." The agents didn't flinch, their faces impassive as they hauled him through the terminal, onlookers gawking and whispering. Back at the FBI field office, Carter briefed Danielle and Emily, his tone clipped but triumphant. "Larson tried to run, but we've got him. He's unraveling." Danielle nodded, her mind already spinning toward the next move. "Good. Let's see how long he holds out before he cracks." Emily frowned, her brow creasing with doubt. "Do you think he'll talk?" Carter leaned back, his arms crossed. "If he doesn't, the evidence will scream loud enough for him." Chaos reigned in the field office as agents sifted through seized documents, each page peeling back another layer of the corruption network. Names emerged: officials, middlemen tangled in a web of bribery, threats, and buried truths. But the structure was fracturing. Larson's allies, once bound by loyalty to Edward Thornton, now turned on each other like cornered animals. In one interrogation room, Officer Bradley, a small-time cog in the machine, sat hunched across from an agent, sweat glistening on his forehead. "It wasn't my idea," he blurted, his voice high and frantic. "Larson called the shots. He just did what he said." In another room, Lieutenant Miller leaned back, his arms crossed, a sneer curling his lip. "Bradley's full of it," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "He was neck deep in this, same as Larson. If you want the truth, squeeze him." The agent scribbled every word, every contradiction, weaving the infighting into a tighter noose. From the observation room, Carter watched, his arms folded, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "They're devouring each other," Danielle said as she joined him, Her voice low but laced with satisfaction. Carter nodded. Desperation's a hell of a motivator. But we need someone bigger to flip if we're going to hit the top, Thorne. Danielle's eyes narrowed, her resolve hardening. He's our key, but he won't break easy. Carter's gaze drifted to the glass. Not yet. Outside, the world churned with a different fight. The media seized the case, splintering public opinion into jagged shards. Some hailed Danielle as a warrior for justice, a beacon against corruption's tide. Others vilified her, their headlines venomous. Is Danielle Carter playing the race card for fame? A pundit on a late-night news show jabbed a finger at the camera, his voice booming. The so-called prosecutor's tearing down decent officers for her own ego. She's the problem, not the fix. Alone in her apartment, Danielle scrolled through the barrage, her jaw tight, her fingers hovering over each hateful word race baiter, opportunist, fraud. The phone rang, Emily's voice cutting through the silence. You seeing this trash? Yeah, Danielle said, her tone flat but heavy. It's the same old playbook, Thorne, and Larson's last gasp to smear me. Emily's voice softened. Don't let it sink in. I won't, Danielle said, though the weight clung to her like damp cloth. But this isn't just about meets an attack on everyone fighting for what's right. Meanwhile, Thorne's legal team struck back, filing motions to bury evidence and sowing doubt about the investigation's legitimacy. In a sleek press conference, one attorney stood before flashing cameras, his voice smooth as silk. This case is built on shaky ground-tainted evidence, biased motives. We'll prove it. The battle lines deepened, justice hanging in the balance. Its lesson stark. Power, unchecked, breeds ruin. But the fight to dismantle it demands a courage that burns brighter than fear. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Edward Thorne's legal team threw accusations like daggers, branding the FBI and Danielle as orchestrators of a baseless witch hunt. Their words echoed off the polished walls, sharp and venomous. But Thorne himself stood apart from the chaos. He moved through the proceedings with a stillness that bordered on eerie, his every gesture deliberate, his face a mask of quiet control. Outside, as reporters swarmed him after a hearing, their cameras flashing like a storm of lightning, he offered them a faint, calculated smile. I trust completely in the truth, he said, his voice smooth as silk. These claims have no foundation. The crowd scribbled furiously, captivated by his unshaken poise. While inside Danielle's office, the air grew thick with frustration. She stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the footage replay on a muted television screen. Her jaw tightened as Thorne's calm demeanor mocked her efforts. He wasn't rattled, not yet. Carter stepped into the room, his boots scuffing the worn carpet, and leaned against her desk. He's playing a slow burn, he said, his tone heavy with observation. Thinks his wealth and his web of allies will keep him untouchable. Danielle's eyes narrowed, her fingers tapping against her elbow. Not this time, she replied, her voice edged with steel. We'll see to that. She turned away from the screen, her mind already racing toward the next move, determined to unravel the empire Thorne believed invincible. The pressure didn't let up. It pressed down on Danielle like a physical weight, seeping into every corner of her life. The media painted her as a zealot, a prosecutor obsessed, while whispers of doubt crept through her own ranks. Colleagues she'd once trusted began to pull away, their sit-along glances heavy with unease. Some were subtle, avoiding her in the hallways, their footsteps quickening as she approached. Others were bolder, over a lukewarm coffee at a lunch break. One prosecutor, a weary man with tired eyes, leaned across the table, his voice low but pointed. Why are you so hell-bent on this one, Danielle? You're stirring up a hornet's nest. Powerful people don't like being cornered. She felt the heat rise in her chest, a mix of anger and disbelief. Because it's justice, she snapped, her fork clattering against her plate. Isn't that why we signed up for this? To do what's right, not what's easy? He shrugged, unimpressed, sipping his coffee. Sure, but you're picking a fight with giants. Watch it doesn't crush you. She swallowed her retort, forcing a tight thanks for the tip before standing and walking away, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Alone in the corridor, she clenched her fists, the sting of isolation fueling her resolve. As the case intensified, A cryptic tip landed in Danielle's inbox, an anonymous whisper about a clandestine meeting between two of Thorne's lieutenants. Her pulse quickened as she read it, the words igniting a flicker of hope. She called Carter immediately, and within hours, they'd assembled a team for a surveillance operation. The meeting unfolded at a private club on the city's edge, a sprawling estate cloaked in shadows and guarded by towering pines. Danielle crouched in a cramped van a half-mile away, the air inside stale and warm. Her knees pressed against a tangle of equipment. Hidden microphones crackled to life, feeding her the voices of Thorne's men. "We've got to kill this thing," one growled, his tone jagged with panic. "If Thorne falls, we're all finished." The other, colder and more resigned, replied, "Let him sink. He's too proud to flip anyway." Danielle's breath caught, her headphones digging into her scalp as she strained to hear more. She glanced at Carter, his face lit by the faint glow of a monitor. "Names?" she whispered. He shook his head, frustration etching lines across his brow. "Not yet." But Thorne's hold is slipping. That night, alone in her apartment, Danielle sat on her couch, the weight of the day pressing into her bones. The media's barbs, the cracks in Thorne's network, the looming threat of vengeance seed all swirled in her mind, a storm she couldn't escape. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. An unknown number. The message was short, chilling. "You're making enemies in high places. Don't think you're untouchable." Her stomach twisted, but her resolve hardened like iron. She forwarded it to Carter with a single command: "Let's end this." The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the moonless sky. Its rusted walls sagged under years of neglect, broken windows gaping like wounds. Danielle stood a block away with Carter and a squad of FBI agents, their vests heavy with gear, their breaths fogging in the cold night air. Carter's voice cut through the silence, low and firm. "We've got confirmation. Thorne's inside, along with at least 6 of his crew. They're armed to the teeth and won't go down easy." Danielle adjusted her vest, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. "We take him alive," she said, meeting Carter's gaze. "He's the key to dismantling this thing." Carter nodded, then signaled the team. They fanned out, shadows merging with the darkness as they encircled the building. The breach was house glass shattered, wood splintered, and floodlights blazed to life, bathing the warehouse in harsh white light. Gunfire erupted, a deafening roar that split the night. Bullets pinged off metal, spitting sparks into the air. Hostiles on the second floor. An agent shouted over the comms, his voice taut with urgency. Danielle dove behind a stack of rotting crates, the stench of mildew sharp in her nose. She peered out, spotting a figure on a balcony above, his rifle spitting fire. She steadied her breathing, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the man ducked, cursing as he retreated. "Push up," Carter barked, his voice cutting through the din. The team advanced, methodical and relentless, their gunfire a steady rhythm as they cleared the ground floor. Danielle and Carter moved as a unit, weapons raised, their steps synchronized. A guard lunged from behind a pile of pallets, his face twisted in desperation. But Danielle's reflexes were faster. Her shot dropped him cleanly, and she called, "Clear." As the echoes faded, the remaining guards faltered, their weapons clattering to the floor as they raised trembling hands. Carter barked orders to cuff them while Danielle led a smaller team upstairs, her heart pounding against her ribs. They found Thorne in a back office, a sterile island of calm amid the wreckage. He sat behind a desk, his suit pristine, his posture relaxed as if he'd been expecting them all along. "Ah, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice smooth and taunting. "I wondered when you'd grace me with your presence." Danielle kept her gun trained on him, her finger hovering near the trigger. "Edward Thorne, you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Get up." He leaned back, folding his hands with deliberate ease. "You've been relentless, I'll admit, but you won't enjoy what you uncover." Her patience snapped. "Stand up." He smirked, rising slowly, his movements languid. As Carter cuffed him, Thorne leaned in, his whisper chilling her skin. "You think I'm the end of this, you're naive." She met his gaze, unflinching, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. Back at the FBI field office, Thorne sat in an interrogation room. flanked by agents whose stares bore into him. Danielle and Carter watched through the one-way glass, tension radiating between them. "He's a rock," Carter muttered. "Won't crack easy." Danielle exhaled sharply. "Let me take a shot." She entered the room, dropping a thick dossier onto the table with a thud that echoed off the walls. She sat across from him, her eyes locked on his. "You're done, Thorne. We've got your bank records, witnesses, communications veri tying you to Larson's network. It's finished." He chuckled, a low, grating sound. "Finished? You've barely scratched the paint." Her gaze sharpened. "Then fill me in." He leaned forward, cuffs clinking, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "This isn't one operation. It's a machinapolitions, CEOs, even your precious law enforcement, all woven together to keep dreamers like you in check." Her lips tightened. "Dreamers like me." "Yes," he said, his smile venomous. "Idealists who think toppling me changes the game. Someone else is always waiting." She leaned closer, her voice a blade. "Then I'll take them down to, one by one." His smirk widened. "Best of luck. You'll need it." She stood, leaving the room without a backward glance. Carter met her in the hall. "Anything?" he asked. "He hinted at a larger system," she said. "But no names, not yet." Carter nodded. "He's right. Thothis is deeper than we thought." Her jaw set. "Then we dig deeper. Thorne's a piece of the puzzle. Bringing him down still matters." Carter clapped her shoulder. "Damn right. Let's keep moving." The weeks after Thorne's arrest were a tempest of activity investigatis unfurled. Indictments rained down, and the rot in the system began to surface. Danielle sat in a packed press conference, her arms crossed, watching the police chief address a sea of reporters. His voice boomed with authority. "Effective immediately, we're overhauling this department. Officers tied to corruption are out, and an independent oversight board will ensure accountability going forward." The room erupted in questions, but Danielle's mind drifted. Thorne's fall was a victory, a crack in the facade of unchecked power. But his words lingered, a reminder that justice was a relentless pursuit. The lesson sank deep. Power abused would always face consequences, even if the fight stretched beyond one man, one case, one lifetime. She stood, slipping out into the cool evening air, ready for the battles ahead. The air was thick with tension as a group of officials stood in a dimly lit corridor, their faces etched with a mix of dread and resignation. Some among them fidgeted nervously, their eyes darting toward the exits as if contemplating escape from the storm of scrutiny bearing down on them. They were men and women accustomed to wielding authority, but now they stood on the precipice of disgrace, some facing charges that threatened to unravel their carefully constructed lives. Among this somber assembly was Larson, a man whose broad shoulders once carried the weight of a badge with pride. Now, that badge was gone, stripped away like a tarnished relic, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. His trial loomed on the horizon, a reckoning for his role in a sprawling network of corruption that had festered in the shadows for far too long. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, betraying the turmoil roiling within, a cocktail of defiance, shame, and the bitter realization that his fall was inevitable. Carter, a weary figure with sharp eyes that missed nothing, leaned toward Danielle, his voice a low murmur beneath the hum of the room. "None of this would be happening if we hadn't pushed them to the wall," he said, his tone laced with a quiet satisfaction that belied the exhaustion etched into his features. Danielle, standing beside him with her arms crossed, gave a slow nod. Her dark hair framed a face set in determination, though her eyes carried a heaviness that spoke of sleepless nights and relentless battles. "It's a start," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with a somber edge. "But you and I both know this doesn't mend the cracks in the foundation." Carter's lips curved into a faint, weary smile, a glimmer of hope flickering in his gaze. "Maybe not," he conceded, "but it's a damn sight better than where we were yesterday." His words hung between them, a fragile thread of optimism in a world that often seemed determined to snuff it out. Later that day, the atmosphere shifted as Danielle stepped into a community center, its walls lined with faded posters and its air thick with the scent of brewed coffee. She joined Emily, a woman whose quiet strength radiated through her measured movements, at a meeting with local leaders. The room buzzed with cautious optimism, a fragile hope that clung to the edges of every word spoken. Malcolm Reed, a towering figure with a voice that commanded attention, leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly. "People are paying attention now," he said, his deep baritone cutting through the murmurs. "This case showed everyone that even the untouchable can bleed. But trust, that's a garden that doesn't bloom overnight." His eyes, sharp and unyielding, met Danielle's, searching for assurance that this wasn't just a fleeting victory. She nodded, her expression resolute. "I get it," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much to offer empty promises. "Real accountability isn't just about punishing a few bad apple sits, about dismantling the orchard that grew them." Across the table, Evelyn, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, shifted in her seat. Her hands, gnarled from years of labor, rested on the table as she fixed Danielle with a piercing gaze. "You've lit a spark, Miss Carter," she said, her voice soft but firm, like the rustle of leaves before a storm. "You've shown us what can be done when someone dares to stand up. But this fight, it's a river that never stops flowing." Danielle met her eyes, feeling the gravity of Evelyn's words settle into her bones. "I know," she replied, her tone quiet but unwavering, "and I'm not planning to step back anytime soon." The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the unspoken alliance between these voices of the community forging a bond stronger than any formal pact. Amid the whirlwind of public battles and professional chaos, Danielle found fleeting solace in the warmth of her childhood home. That evening, she stood in the kitchen beside her younger sister, Mia, the soft hum of music weaving through the air like a gentle embrace. The worn wooden counter was strewn with vegetables, carrots, onions, a head of garlic, and Danielle's hands moved with practiced ease as she chopped, the rhythmic thud of the knife a grounding counterpoint to the storm in her mind. Mia, her dark curls bouncing as she stirred a pot on the stove, shot her a teasing grin. "You're all over the news these days," she said, her voice light but laced with pride. "The neighbors keep asking if I can snag them your autograph." Danielle let out a laugh, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep and unguarded, shaking her head as she brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "A celebrity's the last thing I want to be," she said, her tone softening. "I just want to do the work." Mia paused, her spoon hovering over the pot as her expression shifted to something tender. "You're more than your job, you know," she said quietly. "What you've done, it's bigger than any case file." Danielle looked at her sister, a swell of gratitude warming her chest, and murmured, "Thanks, Mia. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." As the ripples of reform began to take shape, Danielle found herself thrust into an unexpected role, a reluctant emblem of justice. Her days blurred into a whirlwind of community events, interviews, and speeches, each one a chance to stoke the embers of change. Yet despite the praise that rained down on her, she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, never letting the applause drown out the mission. One crisp evening, she stood on a stage at a local university, the auditorium packed with students whose faces glowed with a mix of curiosity and awe. The spotlight bathed her in a harsh glow, but her voice rang out clear and steady. "Justice isn't some finish line we cross," she told them, her words cutting through the stillness. "It's a battle we wage every day, one that demands we keep the powerful in check. This isn't about me or this one victory, it's about forging a system where truth and fairness outweigh wealth or clout." The crowd erupted in applause, a thunderous wave that crashed over her. But Danielle's face remained composed, almost distant. She stepped off the stage, slipping into the throng of students, dodging the spotlight as if it were a pursuer she'd rather outrun. Weeks later, Danielle sat alone in her office, the city sprawling beyond her window like a living tapestry of light and shadow. A new case file lay open on her desk, its pages brimming with fresh injustices begging for her attention. The skyline glittered, each pinprick of light a silent testament to the challenges still lurking in the dark corners of the world she fought to mend. A soft knock broke her reverie, and Carter stepped in, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Figured you could use this," he said, setting it down with a gentle thud. She glanced up, offering a tired smile. "Thanks," she murmured, her fingers brushing the file as she spoke. Carter arched a brow, his voice dry but warm. "Already diving into the next one, huh?" Danielle's lips twitched into a smirk. The work doesn't pause, does it? He chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. Nope. Just don't forget to come up for air now and then. I'll try, she said, though they both knew the promise was as thin as the steam rising from her cup. As Carter slipped out, Danielle set the file aside for a moment, her gaze drifting to the city below. The reforms were a hard-won triumph, but the lesson was clear: power, when abused, left scars that demanded reckoning, and justice was a flame that needed constant tending. Her phone buzzed, jolting her back to the present. A message from a new whistleblower flashed across the screen, words brimming with urgency and the promise of another fight. Danielle exhaled, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she reached for the file once more. The city wasn't perfect from it, but it was hers to defend. Her journey stood as a stark reminder of the cost of challenging corruption, the sleepless nights, the enemies made, the quiet moments of doubt. Yet it also underscored a deeper truth: when power oversteps, it sows the seeds of its own downfall, and those brave enough to demand accountability can shift the tides. The scars of Larson's betrayal, the community's fragile hope, the weight of Evelyn's wisdom, all of it fueled her resolve. The fight was endless, but it was worth every step. In the fluorescent-lit aisle of the small-town grocery store, the air hung heavy with the scent of packaged goods and unspoken tension. Emily stood there, her posture straight as a soldier's, her graying hair pulled back tightly in a no-nonsense bun. She'd faced men far more daunting than Mike Johnson in her 22 years with the U.S. Army were hardened sergeants, unpredictable insurgents, but there was something about this moment that stirred her deeply. "With all due respect, officer," she said, her voice steady and measured, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime's discipline. "Wearing that badge doesn't give you a free pass to ignore common courtesy. Being a leader starts with the little things like cleaning up your own mess." Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, locked onto his, daring him to dismiss her. Mike Johnson, clad in a police uniform that strained slightly against his broad chest and rounded belly, let a slow, mocking smirk crawl across his face. He crossed his arms, the fabric of his sleeves stretching taut with the motion, as if his very presence demanded more space than the narrow aisle could offer. "Listen, sweetheart," he drawled, dragging the word out with deliberate condescension, his tone dripping with the arrogance of someone who'd grown to comfortable wielding authority. "Why don't you stick to your own business? You don't have the faintest clue what it's like to carry this badge." His smirk widened, a challenge glinting in his eyes, as if he'd already won this little skirmish in his mind. Emily felt her jaw tighten, a flicker of heat rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down, her years of training anchoring her composure. She took a breath, the kind that steadied her before a march or a mission, and replied, "I know precisely what it's like to wear a uniform, Officer Johnson. 22 years in the Army taught me more about respect with giving it, and earning it than you might imagine." Her words were calm, but they cut through the air like a bayonet, precise and unrelenting. The smirk on Mike's face faltered, replaced by a hard, narrowing glare. For a moment, they stood there, two forces colliding in silence, their eyes locked in a battle neither seemed willing to concede. Around them, the grocery store buzzed faintly with the hum of everyday life carts squeaking, cans clinking, but the aisle had become a stage. A couple of shoppers, their carts laden with cereal boxes and frozen dinners, slowed to a crawl, their heads tilted as if inspecting the nutritional labels on a jar of pickles. Their sit-along glances betrayed their true interest, the drama unfolding before them. One woman, her fingers still wrapped around a loaf of bread, whispered to her companion, her voice too low to catch but her curiosity plain as day. Mike let out a snort, a harsh puff of air that broke the stillness. "Army, huh?" he said, his tone thick with derision. "Well, this ain't some boot camp, and you sure as hell aren't my drill sergeant. You don't get to order me around in here." His voice carried a bravado that didn't quite reach his eyes, and he shifted his weight, the creak of his leather belt punctuating his words. He was a man accustomed to deference, to townsfolk nodding and stepping aside, and Emily's refusal to bend rattled him more than he'd admit. Emily didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her boots tapping softly against the linoleum floor, her voice dropping to a low, firm register that held an unshakable resolve. "I'm not ordering you, officer. I'm asking you to do what's right." That badge pinned to your chest, it's not just a decoration. It's a promise to this town. A symbol of responsibility. People look to you to set the standard. If you can't even pick up after yourself in a grocery store, what kind of message does that send? Her words weren't loud, but they landed like stones, each one rippling through the growing unease in Mike's expression. His face darkened, a flush creeping up his thick neck, staining his skin a mottled red. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him, the shoppers pausing mid-aisle. A teenage boy a few rows over fumbling with his phone. The faint click of a camera shutter slicing through the tension. Is this some kind of joke? Mike barked, his voice rising, sharp and jagged with frustration. You don't know a damn thing about me, lady. What are you, some washed-up vet with nothing better to do than preach at people in a supermarket? His words were meant to wound, to push her back, but they only fueled the fire simmering in Emily's chest. The onlookers stirred, a murmur threading through the crowd like a current. Emily's shoulders stiffened, but she stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. She inhaled slowly, the air cool against her lips, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as steel. I don't know you, Officer Johnson, she said, each syllable deliberate. But I know what integrity looks like, and I'm not seeing it here. The word integrity hung in the air, sharp and accusing, and it struck Mike like a blow. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides, knuckles whitening as if he might lash out or crumble. You've got some nerve, he spat, his voice low and venomous, his bulk shifting as he loomed over her. You think you're tough, huh? Some old lady playing soldier? Let me tell you something, nobody gives a damn about your glory days. He leaned in, his breath hot and sour, his presence an attempt to intimidate, to reclaim the power he felt slipping through his fingers. Emily didn't budge. She met his glare head-on, her eyes burning with a quiet, unyielding strength. This isn't about me, she said, her voice slicing through the tension like a honed blade. And it's not about you, it's about doing what's right. If you can't handle being called out for something as simple as this, maybe you're in the wrong line of work. Her words were a mirror, reflecting his flaws back at him. And for a fleeting moment, she saw something flicker in his ice anger. Yes, but also a shadow of doubt. By now, the crowd had swelled, a semicircle of onlookers forming around them. Whispers rustled like leaves in the winsome disapproving, some intrigued, a few nodding faintly in agreement with Emily. The teenager with the phone edged closer, his sneakers squeaking against the floor as he angled for a better shot, his thumbs tapping the screen with the eagerness of someone who knew this moment might go viral. Another shopper, a middle-aged woman with a toddler tugging at her sleeve, watched with wide eyes, her grip tightening on her cart as if bracing for what might come next. Mike's gaze darted toward the growing audience, his bravado faltering under the weight of their scrutiny. Why don't you just walk away? He hissed, his voice tight, almost pleading, though he masked it with a sneer. Because walking away doesn't fix anything, Emily replied, her tone calm but edged with steel. You might be used to people turning a blind eye, but not today. Her words were a quiet defiance, a refusal to let this moment dissolve into the ordinary hum of the store. Before Mike could fire back, a new voice cut through the standoff. What's going on here? It called, tentative but firm. Tom, the store manager, emerged from the end of the aisle, his weary frame dwarfed by the tension filling the space. His glasses glinted under the harsh lights, and his name tag pinned crookedly to his faded palabob as he approached. Behind him, two employees lingered, a young cashier with a mop of curly hair and an older stock boy with a weary slump, their eyes flicking nervously between Emily and Mike. Emily turned to Tom, her posture easing slightly, but her resolve unshaken. There's a spill in the aisle, she said, her voice even, as if explaining a simple fact. I asked Officer Johnson to clean it up, but he seems to think he's above it. Tom's face paled, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. He glanced at Mike, whose flush had deepened into a furious crimson, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. Oh, we'll get someone on that right away, Tom stammered, his hands fluttering nervously as he gestured to the hovering employees. Emily shook her head, her gray eyes pinning Tom in place. That's not the point, she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. This isn't just about a mess on the floor. It's about accountability, about what it means to wear that uniform, She nodded toward Mike, whose fists remained clenched, his breaths coming in short, angry bursts. Tom hesitated, caught between the two, his thin lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. He was a man unaccustomed to conflict, more at home with inventory lists than human standoffs, and the weight of the moment seemed to press him into the floor. Mike seized the chance to shift the tide. He straightened, his broad shoulders squaring as he jabbed a finger at Emily. "She's causing a scene," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to slice through the murmurs. "Why don't you ask her to leave?" His tone was commanding, a bid to reassert control, but it wavered slightly under the scrutiny of the crowd. Tom's eyes darted between them, his discomfort palpable. But Emily didn't give him the chance to respond. "If holding someone accountable is causing a scene," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the aisle, "then maybe this town needs more scenes like this." A faint ripple of agreement hummed through the onlookersnids from a gray-haired man, clutching a bag of apples, a soft MMHMM from the woman with the toddler. Mike's face twisted, frustration boiling over, but before he could retort, the click of the teenager's phone camera snapped through the air again, freezing him mid-breath. His eyes flicked toward the boy, then the crowd, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his armor, a flicker of uncertainty, a realization that this wasn't just a petty argument anymore. Emily saw it, that brief falter, and pressed forward. "You're not just a man in a uniform, Officer Johnson," she said, her voice steady but piercing. "You're a piece of this community. And right now, the community's watching." Mike's jaw worked silently, his mind racing for a comeback. But the weight of those iced teenagers' lens, the shopper's stare spinned him in place. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as the tension in the aisle peaked, a coiled spring ready to snap. Then, finally, he broke it, his voice strained, laced with barely leashed fury. "Fine," he growled, the word forced through gritted teeth. "You want me to pick it up? Is that what this is all about?" Emily didn't move, her expression calm but unyielding. "It's not about the macaroni or the soda," she said, her tone resolute. "It's about accountability, Officer Johnson. But yes, picking it up would be a start." Her words hung there, a quiet challenge wrapped in reason, and the crowd held its breath. Mike muttered something under his breath, a curse, a complaint, too low to catch and cast a final, resentful glance at the onlookers. The weight of their gazes bore down on him, an unspoken judgment he couldn't shake. With a huff, he bent down, his movements stiff and reluctant, his knees creaking as he snatched up the fallen items, a box of macaroni, a dented soda bottle. He tossed them onto a nearby shelf with a careless shove, the bottle teetering before settling. "There," he snapped, straightening up and fixing Emily with a glare that could have melted steel. "Happy now?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She studied him for a moment, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his seething anger, then gave a single, measured nod. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice soft but firm, a quiet victory in its restraint. The words seemed to stoke Mike's rage further, his fists clenching anew, but he said nothing. The crowd watched, the teenager's phone still rolling, capturing every second of a moment that spoke louder than any sermon about justice, about power, and about the consequences of forgetting what that badge truly meant. The confrontation had left the air thick with tension, a palpable weight that clung to the fluorescent-lit aisles of the small-town grocery store. Mike Johnson's face had turned a deep shade of crimson, his cheeks puffed out as though he were holding back a storm of words. His fists, balled tightly at his sides, trembled slightly from fear, but from the raw fury coursing through him, he looked like a man on the verge of exploding. His broad shoulders hunched forward as if ready to lunge. Yet, something stopped him. The growing knot of onlookers, their curious eyes wide and whispers buzzing like flies, held him in check. Then there was the phony, a small, unassuming device in someone's hand, its camera lens pointed squarely at him, recording every twitch of his expression. That tiny red light seemed to mock him, a silent judge capturing his unraveling. With a sharp, almost violent twist of his body, he spun on his heel and stormed toward the front of the store, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor like the beat of a war drum. The crowd parted instinctively, their murmurs swelling into a low hum that lingered long after he disappeared from sight. Emily stood there, her cart half filled with groceries, feeling the weight of a dozen gazes pressing into her back. Her heart beat steadily, though a faint tremor of adrenaline still pulsed in her veins. She didn't turn to meet their eyes, didn't need to. She could sense their mix of awe, curiosity, and unease without looking. The air hadn't cleared. It hung heavy, charged with the residue of what had just unfolded. She gripped the handle of her cart a little tighter, her knuckles whitening for a moment before she forced herself to relax. She wasn't here for their approval or their whispers. She hadn't squared off against Mike Johnson for applause. To her, it was simple. Right was right, and wrong was wrong. That was the compass she'd lived by through years in the military, through battles both literal and figurative, and it guided her now as she pushed her cart forward, wheels squeaking faintly against the polished floor. As she rounded the corner into the next aisle, a woman stepped into her path. She was middle-aged, her face softened by years but etched with a quiet strength. Her slight southern drawl rolled out like warm honey as she spoke, her voice low and earnest. "Ma'am," she began, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to him. I mean, that man Mike Johnson has been strutting around this town like he owns it for as long as I can remember." Her eyes darted over her shoulder, a quick, nervous glance, as if she half expected Mike to materialize behind her. Emily offered a small, polite smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just glad people saw it," she replied, her tone measured. "Maybe it'll shake things up a little." The woman nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. More than most around here. But you watch yourself. Here, men like him, they don't take kindly to being put in their place." There was a flicker of something in her eyes, worry, maybe, or a shadow of personal experience. Emily's smile wavered, just for a second, but she dipped her head in acknowledgement. "I appreciate it," she said, her voice steady, "but I've handled worse than him." The woman hesitated, her mouth opening as if she wanted to press further, to spill some untold story or warning. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering uncertainly before giving Emily's arm a gentle pat. Then she turned and shuffled away, her sneakers scuffing softly against the floor. Emily watched her go, her mind already drifting back to the scene in the aisle. She wasn't afraid of micking it, really. She'd stared down men with more power, more venom, and more weapons than he'd ever dream of wielding. In her years in the military, she'd learned how to read people like him, proud, brittle, and dangerous when cornered. But the woman's words gnawed at her, a quiet echo she couldn't quite shake. Men like him don't take kindly to being embarrassed. She pushed her cart onward, weaving through shelves stocked with canned goods and cereal boxes, her thoughts replaying the confrontation. In vivid detail, the way Mike's voice had cracked with indignation, the way his badge gleamed under the harsh store lights, a symbol of authority he wore like a crown. By the time she reached the checkout line, the store had slipped back into its usual rhythm. The cashier's scanners beeped in a steady cadence, customers exchanged small talk about the weather, and the faint strains of a pop song drifted from the overhead speakers, tinny and forgettable. Emily unloaded her groceries onto the conveyor belt: milk, bread, a bag of apples, her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. She wanted to leave the incident behind, to let it fade like a bad dream. But as she swiped her card and gathered her bags, a shadow caught her eye near the exit. There he was, Mike Johnson, leaning against the wall by the sliding glass doors. His arms were crossed over his chest, his posture casual, but his presence anything but. His face was a mask, unreadable yet simmering with something dark. Emily's stomach tightened, not out of fear but irritation. She squared her shoulders, adjusted the bags in her hands, and walked toward him. Her steps slow and purposeful, each one a quiet declaration that she wouldn't be cowed. He straightened as she neared, pushing off the wall to block her path. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a low growl, icy and sharp. Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression cool and unflinching. "Is there something else you'd like to say, Officer Johnson?" He glanced around, his eyes flicking to the shoppers milling nearby, their carts rattling as they passed. His voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper. "You made me look like a damn fool back there." Emily didn't blink. "You managed that all on your own," she replied, her tone flat but cutting. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath the skin, and he stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. "You think you're some kind of hero? Huh? Calling me out in front of everyone?" Emily held his gaze, her own eyes steady and unyielding. "I think accountability matters," she said evenly. "If you're mad about how you looked, maybe take a hard look at why that happened instead of pointing fingers at me." Mike let out a bitter laugh, a harsh, grating sound that echoed faintly in the open space. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Emily tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smirk. "No, I don't. Especially not when it comes to what's right." The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken threats and defiance. A few passers-by slowed, their heads turning as they sensed the brewing storm. Mike noticed, his posture stiffening. He forced a smile onto his face, tight and insincere, his teeth barely showing. "You're real smug for someone who doesn't even know who they're dealing with." Emily didn't flinch. "And you're real arrogant for someone hiding behind a badge." For a moment, his mask's lip at his eyes blazed with fury, a wildfire barely contained. But then he stepped back, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Have it your way. But don't think this is over." He turned and walked away, his stride stiff and angry, disappearing into the crowd. Emily stood there, her bags weighing down her arms, her face a blank slate. She didn't call after him, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply adjusted her grip and stepped out into the parking lot. The winter air hit her like a slap, crisp and biting. The sky a dull gray streaked with the last light of day. She loaded her groceries into the trunk of her car, her movements slow and methodical, her mind churning. "Don't think this is over." She wasn't scared, not yet, but she knew his type too well. Men like Mike thrived on control, and when it slipped through their fingers, they lashed out. As she slammed the trunk shut and slid into the driver's seat, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, frowning at the screen. It was a text from Karen, her neighbor, a weary, cheerful woman who'd taken to keeping an eye on Emily's house whenever she was away. "Saw the video of you at the store. You okay? People are talking." Emily's brow furrowed deeper. "What video?" she typed back. Karen's reply came almost instantly. "Someone filmed you and the cop arguing. It's all over Facebook. You're a damn local celebrity now." Emily sighed, running a hand through her short, cropped hair. Fame was the last thing she wanted. She'd spent her life avoiding spotlights, preferring the quiet of routine over the chaos of attention. She just wanted to live peacefully, simply, without the weight of eyes on her every move. But as she started the car and pulled out of the lot, a nagging feeling settled in her chest. This wasn't the end. Men like Mike didn't let slights fester quietly, and now the whole town was watching, their phones lighting up with the story of her defiance. By the time she reached her driveway, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across her modest suburban home. She carried her bags inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting her like an old friend. She unpacked slowly, her mind still tangled in the day's events, replaying Mike's parting words like a looped recording. She'd just stashed the last of the groceries, a carton of eggs tucked neatly in the fridge, when her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Karen. The number was unknown, a string of digits she didn't recognize. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen, a faint prickle of unease creeping up her spine. Then she answered. "Hello." A pause stretched out, heavy and deliberate, before a voice cut through the line, cold, sharp, and all too familiar. "You don't know when to stop, do you?" Emily's grip tightened on the phone, her knuckles whitening. "Officer Johnson," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "How did you get this number?" "That doesn't matter," he snapped, his tone bristling with barely restrained rage. "What matters is you think you can humiliate me and walk away like it's nothing." Emily's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "This is harassment, Officer Johnson," she said, each word precise and deliberate. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next." There was another pause, longer this time, the silence crackling with tension. Then the line went dead. She lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. Mike wasn't just angry, it was unraveling. his pride a festering wound she'd unwittingly prodded. And in that moment, she understood the deeper lesson woven into the day's chaos. Justice wasn't just about standing up. It was about facing the fallout. Power, when abused, didn't bow quietly, it fought back, clawing to reclaim its throne. Emily set the phone down on the counter, her eyes drifting to the darkening windows. Outside, the world was still, but she knew the storm was far from over. In the stillness of her kitchen, Emily Carter stood frozen, the phone still warm in her hand as the echo of Mike Johnson's voice lingered in her ears. His words had slithered through the line, low and menacing, dripping with a venom that promised retribution. "This isn't over." Then, silence, a sharp, jarring cut as the call ended. Her pulse thudded steadily, a soldier's rhythm honed by years of discipline. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her mind churned like a storm breaking over open water. She lowered the phone with deliberate care, placing it on the counter as if it were a live grenade, and drew in a long, steadying breath. The air tasted faintly of the cold tea she'd abandoned earlier, its bitterness mirroring the unease settling into her bones. Emily wasn't a stranger to threats she'd faced worse in dusty war zones half a world away. But this felt different. This was personal, a challenge issued on her own turf, and she'd be damned if she let it shake her resolve. She sank into a chair at the kitchen table, her gaze drifting over the remnants of a meal she'd barely touched. A half-eaten sandwich sat forlornly on its plate, the bread curling slightly at the edges, while beside it, a chipped mug of tea had long since lost its warmth. Her appetite had vanished hours ago, chased away by the day's chaos, and now the silence of the room pressed in around her, broken only by the soft, relentless ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the streetlights hummed faintly, their amber glow spilling across her driveway in uneven patches, illuminating the ordinary world she'd once taken for granted. She reached for her phone again, her fingers brushing its cool surface as she scrolled through a flood of notifications. Her friend Karen had sent a link, a video, no doubt the one everyone was buzzing about. Against the nagging voice of caution in her head, Emily tapped it open. The footage flickered to life, shaky but unmistakable. There she was, standing in the supermarket aisle, her posture straight as a blade, her voice cutting through the air with quiet, unyielding authority. Across from her, Officer Mike Johnson loomed, his broad frame bristling with indignation, his face flushed with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked power. The confrontation had been brief, but electric called him out for knocking over a display of cans and refusing to clean it up, his dismissive sneer only fueling her resolve. The video captured every word, every gesture, and as it ended, Emily scrolled down to the comments. They were a chaotic jumble of voices. "Good for her, Simeon's gotta stand up to these cops. This woman's got guts. Respect. She's just chasing clout, leave the guy alone." Another wannabe hero trying to go viral. She exhaled sharply, a mix of exasperation and disbelief tightening her chest, and shut the app with a flick of her thumb. All she'd wanted was to grab her groceries and get home, not ignite a firestorm that painted her as either a saint or a troublemaker. A sudden, sharp rap at the door shattered her thoughts. Emily stiffened, her breath catching for a fraction of a second before her instincts kicked in. It was far too late for a neighbor dropping by with a friendly hello. She rose silently, her bare feet gliding over the cool hardwood floor as she approached the door, every muscle coiled and ready. Through the peephole, she saw the figures bathed in the porch light's faint glow, uniformed officers, their badges glinting faintly. Her jaw tightened as she unlatched the lock and eased the door open, just enough to meet their gazes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with wariness. The older of the two stepped forward, a stocky man with a thick mustache that seemed to weigh down his weathered face. "Miss Carter?" he said, his tone clipped but not hostile. She nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm Sergeant Bill Hayes. This is Officer Lopez," he continued, tilting his head toward the younger man beside him. Lopez was leaner, his dark eyes darting between Emily and his superior, a faint tension in his posture suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable being there. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident at the supermarket earlier today." Emily's brows lifted, a spark of incredulity flickering in her chest. "Is that so?" she replied, keeping her tone even. Hayes nodded, his expression a blank slate, impossible to read. "Mind if we come in?" he asked, though it felt less like a question and more like a formality. Emily hesitated, her gut twisting at the thought of letting them cross her threshold, inviting officers into her home especially now. With Mike Johnson's threat still ringing in her ears felt like handing over a piece of her sanctuary. But slamming the door shut could light a fuse she wasn't ready to ignite. With a reluctant step back, she waved them inside, her movements stiff but controlled. Their boots thudded heavily against the floor as they entered, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. She gestured toward the living room, where a faded couch sat beneath a framed photo of her unit in Kandahar, a relic of a life she'd left behind but never fully shaken. "Take a seat," she said, her voice cool as she crossed her arms and remained standing, a silent assertion of her ground. Hayes settled onto the couch with a grunt, his broad frame sinking into the cushions, while Lopez perched on the edge, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "What's this about?" Emily asked, her gaze shifting between them. Hayes cleared his throat, the sound rough and deliberate. "We received a complaint from Officer Mike Johnson about your behavior at the market," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "He claims you were aggressive, disruptive, says you even threatened him." Emily's lips parted in a dry, humorless laugh, her head shaking slowly as the absurdity of it sank in. "My behavior," she echoed, her voice sharpening. "That's not what happened." Hayes held up a hand, a gesture meant to calm, but one that only stoked the fire simmering in her chest. "We're just here to get the facts, ma'am. Tell us your side." She drew in a breath, steadying herself, and launched into the story. Her words were precise, measured, each one chosen with the clarity of someone who'd faced far worse than a small-town cop. With a bruised ego, she described how Mike had barreled through the aisle, knocking cans to the floor with a careless sweep of his arm, then sneered when she'd asked him to pick them up. His voice had dripped with condescension. "You don't tell me what to do, lady," and she'd met it with a calm that masked the steel beneath. When she finished, Hayes nodded slowly, his mustache twitching as he processed her account. "And the phone call you got later," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Did you recognize the voice?" Emily's expression hardened, her eyes glinting like flint. It was Mike Johnson. He made it crystal clear this wasn't over. Lopez, who'd been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking to Hayes. "If that's true, Sarge, that's a serious accusation," he said, his voice quieter than his partner's, laced with a hint of unease. Hayes rubbed his chin, his calloused fingers rasping against stubble as he studied her. "Miss Carter, do you have any proof of that call?" he asked, his tone careful but probing. She shook her head, frustration tightening her throat. "No, but I know it was him." Hayes leaned back, the couch creaking under his weight, his eyes tracing the lines of her face as if searching for a crack in her resolve. "Look, ma'am," he said, his voice softening but carrying a weight of warning. "I'm not saying I don't believe you, but this is a small town. Mike's been with the department for years, not a model officer. I'll give you that. But he's got friends in high places." Emily's jaw clenched, her arms dropping to her sides as she leaned forward, her presence filling the room. "So what are you saying, Sergeant? That nothing happens because he's connected?" Hayes met her gaze, unflinching, but not unkind. "I'm saying this could get ugly. If you push this, he'll push back harder. And guys like Mike, they don't fight fair." Emily straightened, her voice low but resolute. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I've faced men like him in war zones. I'm not afraid of him." A long silence stretched between them, Hayes studying her with a mix of respect and resignation. Finally, he nodded. "Fair enough. We'll file a report about the call. If he contacts you again, call us right away." Emily gave a curt nod, though doubt gnawed at her. "Thank you," she said, the words polite but hollow. The officers rose, Hayes extending a hand as they reached the door. "Take care, Miss Carter, and watch your back." She shook his hand, her grip firm, then ushered them out into the night. As the lock clicked into place, she leaned against the door, her breath escaping in a slow, shuddering release. The house settled back into its quiet rhythm, but the weight of the day clung to her like damp cloth. Morning arrived with a relentless buzz. her phone vibrating against the nightstand until she groped for it, bleary-eyed and groaning. The screen lit up with a flood of notification stacks, emails, alerts, and as she squinted at them, her stomach sank. The supermarket video had exploded overnight, ricocheting across platforms, picked up by news outlets with headlines screaming her name. Local woman stands up to Cafaro or hothead. She rubbed her eyes, willing the world to slow down. When the phone rang again, Karen's name flashed across the screen. "Morning, Karen," Emily muttered, her voice thick with sleep. "Emily, you've officially broken the internet." Karen's laugh burst through the line, bright and unrestrained. "You're everywhere news, Twitter, everywhere. They're calling you a hero." Emily sighed, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "I didn't do anything heroic. I told a guy to clean up his mess." Karen chuckled. "Well, apparently that's enough these days. But listen, I'm calling to warn you. Mike's losing it. My brother works at the station, and he says Mike's been ranting about you non-stop. He's furious." Emily sat up straighter, the fog of sleep burning away as Karen's words sank in. She could picture Mike Now's red face, his clenched fists, his voice bellowing through the precinct like a wounded animal. Fury didn't scare her. It was the unpredictability that came with it, the kind of reckless spite that could turn a petty grudge into something dangerous. She thought of Hayes' warning, of Lopez's quiet unease, and felt the lesson settle deep in her chest. Justice wasn't a straight line. Not when power was abused. Not when the system bent to protect its own. Mike's connections might shield him, but they couldn't erase the truth or the consequences he'd face if he pushed her too far. She wasn't just a woman in a viral video. She was a soldier, a survivor. And she'd learned long ago that men who wielded authority like a club often underestimated the strength of those they tried to break. Whatever came next, she'd be ready. The morning air carried a crisp bite as Emily Carter stood in her modest kitchen, the faint aroma of brewing coffee mingling with the tension that had taken root in her chest. Her conversation with Karen from the night before replayed in her mind, each word laced with a nervous tremor that Karen couldn't quite hide. "Just be careful, okay?" Karen had pleaded, her voice tight with worry, as though she could sense the storm brewing on the horizon. Emily had brushed it off with a quick, "I will, but now." As she pulled on her jacket and adjusted the collar in the mirror, her thoughts churned with restless energy. She wasn't about to let Mike Johnson, a man who fed on fear like a vulture, circling a carcass, dictate her next move. Yet, beneath her defiance, a flicker of caution stirred. She wasn't foolish enough to underestimate him. Men like Mike didn't just wield power. They twisted it into a weapon, and she knew he wouldn't relent until someone forced his hand. As she laced up her boots, Emily's resolve hardened into something unshakable. She wasn't going to sit idly by, waiting for Mike to strike again. If he wanted a fight, she'd meet him head-on, but she'd do it her way, calculated, deliberate, and fierce. Her destination was clear: the mayor's office. The drive through Greenwood's quiet streets felt heavier than usual, the familiar sight of weathered storefronts and leafless trees doing little to ease the knot in her stomach. She parked outside the town hall, a squat brick building that seemed to sag under the weight of decades, and took a moment to steady herself before stepping inside. Mayor James Walker's office was a study in understated authority, wood-paneled walls, a worn desk cluttered with papers, and a single window letting in pale, gray light. The man himself stood tall and weary, his 60s showing in the lines etched across his face and the salt and pepper streaks in his hair. His no-nonsense air filled the room as Emily settled into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She recounted every detail: supermarket clash over spilled macaroni and soda, Mike's looming presence as he tried to strong-arm her into submission, the late-night phone call dripping with veiled threats. Walker listened without interruption, his sharp eyes locked on hers, his long fingers steepled on the desk. When she finished, a heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the slow creak of his chair as he leaned back. He sighed, the sound carrying years of frustration. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about Mike Johnson," he admitted, his voice low and gravelly. Emily's brow furrowed, a spark of indignation flaring in her chest. "Then why's he still wearing a badge?" she shot back, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. Walker's frown deepened, his gaze drifting to the window as if searching for an answer in the overcast sky. Small-town politics, Miss Carter. People turn a blind eye, favors get traded, backs get scratched. But that video of him circulating, it's changed the game. I can't sweep this under the rug anymore. Good, Emily replied, her voice firm and unwavering. Because I'm not backing down, and you shouldn't either. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Walker's mouth, a glimmer of respect breaking through his stern facade. You've got guts, he said with a nod. I'll start an investigation into his conduct. But I'll need you to back me up. Emily met his gaze, her jaw set. You've got my word. As she rose and left the office, a surge of purpose coursed through her veins. Mike had misjudged her, pegging her as just another pushover. He was about to learn the hard way that Emily Carter didn't bend, not for him, not for anyone. The drive home was a blur, her mind racing faster than the car itself. What had begun as a petty squabble in the grocery aisle had ballooned into something far uglier, a reckoning that could shake Greenwood's sleepy police force. To its core, she pulled into her driveway and sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the cracked dashboard. A quiet doubt gnawed at her, not about her own resolve, but about the town. Greenwood thrived on its unspoken rule, don't stir the pot. Exposing Mike could unravel a web of secrets no one wanted dragged into the light. But as quickly as the thought surfaced, she crushed it. This wasn't just about her pride or her bruised ego. It was about justice, about holding a man accountable for the power he'd abused. A principle she'd carried like a torch through her years in the military. She wouldn't let it flicker out now. Stepping into her house, the silence pressed against her like a physical weight. The tension of the past few days had seeped into every corner, coating the faded furniture and dim walls in an invisible shroud. For the first time, Emily let herself feel the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of always being the one to stand tall. While others cowered, she sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples, when her phone buzzed sharply on the coffee table. It was Karen again. Emily, she answered, her voice steady despite the fatigue. If this is about another post or it's not that, Karen cut in, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Emily, I think you need to come over here. Now. What's wrong? Emily asked, sitting up straighter, her senses sharpening. It's Mike, Karen said, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. He's been driving up and down our street, real slow. He parked outside your house for a few minutes before he left. Emily's grip tightened around the phone, her knuckles whitening. Did you see where he went? She pressed. Back toward downtown, I think, Karen replied, her breath hitching. Emily, I don't like this. He's not right. Thanks for the heads up, Emily said, her tone clipped but calm. Stay inside. Lock your doors. She hung up, her mind racing. Calling the police crossed her mind for a fleeting second, but she dismissed it just as fast. Half the department would probably shield Mike, and the other half would shrink from the fight. No, this was hers to handle, at least for now. The next morning, Emily decided she couldn't face this alone. She needed allies, voices to amplify her own. She reached out to a handful of Greenwood's steadiest soulspeople she knew wouldn't flinch. When the heat turned up, there was Sarah, who ran the corner bakery with a warm smile and a spine of steel, Reverend Hayes, whose quiet sermons carried a fierce call for righteousness, and David Miller, a retired police captain whose name still echoed with respect in the town's narrow streets. She met David at the diner, a squat little place with chipped formica tables and the faint hum of a jukebox in the corner. He was a broad man in his late 60s, his face weathered but kind, his gray eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. I saw the video, David said as they slid into a booth, his deep voice cutting through the clatter of plates. Doesn't shock me one bit. Mike Johnson's been trouble since the day he pinned on that badge. Emily stirred her coffee, the steam curling up in lazy wisps. Then why's he still around? She asked, her tone edged with frustration. David leaned back, crossing his arms over his faded flannel shirt, his expression darkening. Politics, mostly. His uncle sits on the city council, and the Johnsons have roots here deeper than the oaks out front. He's been untouchably, or he was anyway. Emily set her mug down with a soft clink, meeting his gaze. The mayor's opening an investigation. But I'm not naive, David. I know how these things can disappear. He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. They'll try to bury it, especially if Mike starts pointing fingers at others to save himself. But you've got the public behind you right now. Keep pushing and let them wiggle out of it." His words were blunt, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes, a silent warning he didn't voice outright. "You think he'll come after me?" she asked, her voice steady but searching. David paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mike's a bully, lives for the scare. But bullies turn mean when they're backed into a corner." Emily gave a small, resolute nod. "Good thing I don't scare easy." That evening, she sat on her porch, a chipped mug of tea warming her hands as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Crickets chirped in the distance, a soft hum that usually soothed her restless mind. But tonight, her thoughts churned Karen's frantic call, Mike's slow cruise past her house, David's grim caution. Her phone buzzed on the wobbly table beside her, jolting her from her reverie. She picked it up, her eyes narrowing at the unknown number flashing on the screen. The message was short, dripping with menace. "You've made a big mistake. Walk away while you still can." Her pulse stayed even, but her fingers tightened around the phone, the plastic creaking faintly under the pressure. She didn't need to wonder who sent it. Mike's cowardice was bold enough to hide behind anonymity, but not clever enough to fool her. She set the phone down and took a deliberate sip of tea, her gaze sweeping the shadowed street beyond her yard. The air felt charged, thick with the promise of confrontation. If Mike thought a vague threat would silence her, he'd underestimated her fire. Justice wasn't just a word to Emily, it was a line in the sand, and she'd defend it with everything she had. The lesson was coming, swift and unrelenting. Power, when abused, invited its own downfall, and she'd be the one to deliver it. The air in the dimly lit town hall hung heavy with anticipation, thick enough to choke on. As the people of Greenwood shuffled into their seats, the wooden floor creaked under the weight of boots and restless feet, the sound mingling with the low hum of whispered conversations. Overhead, a ceiling fan spun lazily, doing little to cut through the stifling heat of the late summer evening. Every pair of eyes darted between the front of the room and the back, where shadows danced along the peeling paint of the walls. Emily Carter stood near the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw set with a determination that felt like it had been forged in fire. She wasn't here to play games or mince words. 22 years in the army had stripped her of any patience for nonsense. Tonight, she carried the weight of a truth she couldn't let fester any longer. The silence shattered when Officer Mike Johnson slouched in his chair, his police uniform wrinkled and his badge glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. His face was a storm cloud arc, brooding and ready to unleash thunder at the slightest provocation. He'd spent years wearing that uniform like a crown, letting it puff up his chest with an arrogance that made people shrink in his presence. To him, the badge wasn't just authority, it was a weapon, one he'd wielded too often against the very community he was sworn to protect. Emily could feel the heat of his glare from across the room, but she didn't waver. She'd faced worse than him deserts, gunfire, men twice his size, with half his ego, and she wasn't about to let this small-town tyrant rattle her. Now, Chief Turner, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a voice like gravel, stood at the podium, his hands gripping its edges as if steadying himself against the brewing storm. He'd seen enough in his decades on the force to know what was coming, and the lines etched deep into his forehead told a story of sleepless nights and hard choices. "The Greenwood Police Department stands for something," he began, his words slow and deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. "When one of us in uniform steps out of line, whether it's through arrogance, intimidation, or just plain neglecting our duty, it doesn't just hurt the person on the receiving end. It tears at the trust this town depends on, and without trust, we've got nothing left to hold us together." The room went quiet, the weight of his words sinking into every corner. Emily felt them settle into her bones, stirring a fire she'd kept banked for too long. She stepped forward, her boots thudding against the floor with purpose, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "I didn't come here tonight to point fingers for the sake of embarrassment," she said, her tone steady but laced with an edge of steel. "I'm not here to drag anyone's name through the dirt just for kicks, but I'll be damned if I stand by and let this slide, not when it's about something bigger than any one of us. If we let this go, What are we saying? That it's fine to trample over people. That it's okay to use power like a club and disrespect the folks you're supposed to serve. She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd, farmers with calloused hands, mothers clutching their kids. Old-timers who'd seen this town through better days. I spent 22 years in the Army. I know what a uniform means. It's not a free pass, it's a responsibility. And respect, you don't get that from pinning a badge to your chest. You earn it with what you do. A wave of applause erupted, rolling through the room like thunder after a long drought. Even the mayor, a weary man with a pinched face who'd been perched in the front row, shifted in his seat, his usual mask of indifference cracking just enough to show something human underneath. Emily turned her gaze back to Mike, whose glare had sharpened into something venomous, his lips twitching with barely restrained fury. "You told me this wasn't over," she said, her voice dropping low, meant only for him, though it carried a quiet power that filled the space between them. "And you were right. It's not over, not until this town gets the justice it deserves." Mike shot to his feet, the chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. "I've had enough of this circus," he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the walls. Ron jagged with rage. "This whole thing's a damn witch hunt, and you all know it." He jabbed a finger toward Emily, his hand trembling with the force of his anger. "She's the one stirring up trouble, painting me as some villain when I've been out there keeping this town safe." Chief Turner's face darkened, his patience fraying like an old rope. "Officer Johnson, sit down," he growled, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Mike wasn't having it. "No," he snapped, his voice rising to a near shout. "She's the problem here, not me." Emily didn't flinch. She stood rooted to the spot, her calm a stark contrast to his unraveling. "This isn't about me," she said, her words simple but heavy with truth. "It's about you, Mike. It's about the choices you made, the ones you thought no one would call you on." The room buzzed with tension, a live wire sparking in the air. Chief Turner rose to his full height, his shadow stretching across the floor. "That's enough, Officer Johnson," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "Effective immediately. You're suspended without pay. We're investigating this, and you're off duty until we get to the bottom of it." The words hit Mike like a fist to the gut. His face twisted, shock, fury, disbelief all warring for dominance. For a split second, Emily thought he might lunge at her, his hands flexing at his sides like he was itching to strike. But instead, he snatched his hat off the table, shoved the chair aside with a violent kick, and stormed toward the door. The slam of it echoed like a gunshot, leaving the room in stunned silence. In the days that followed, the town didn't let the dust settle. The investigation into Mike Johnson's conduct grew like a weed, sprouting new tendrils with every complaint that surfaced. Some were fresh incidents from the past few months where his temper had flared, or his authority had crossed into cruelty. Others were older, buried grievances from years past, whispered by people who'd been too afraid to speak until now. Each story painted a clearer picture, a man who'd let power twist him, who'd ruled Greenwood not with justice, but with intimidation, unchecked for far too long. The mayor and Chief Turner didn't shy away from the mess. They opened the books, laid every step bare for the town to see, proving that accountability wasn't just a word, it was a promise. When the investigation wrapped up, the verdict was final. Mike Johnson was out, fired from the Greenwood Police Department, his badge stripped away, his reign of arrogance brought to an end. The town felt the tremors of itchik relief, a quiet hope threading through the cracks. The police force didn't waste time licking its wounds. New training rolled out, sessions hammering home the importance of owning your actions, connecting with the people you served, and cooling tempers before they turned into wildfires. It wasn't a quick fix change, never is, but it was a start. A slow stitching together of a community that had been fraying at the seams. Emily slipped back into her quiet life, her small house on the edge of town a refuge from the storm she'd helped stir. But the ripples of what she'd done didn't fade. People stopped her at the market, their voices soft with gratitude, or caught her on the street to spill their own tales of standing up to wrongs they'd once swallowed in silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, Karen Miller dropped by. She was a weary woman with a quick laugh and eyes that missed nothing, a neighbor who'd watched the whole saga unfold from her front porch. She settled into the rocking chair beside Emily, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. "You know you're a hero to a lot of folks around here, right?" she said, her smile warm but teasing. Emily shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light clung to the treetops. "I'm no hero," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I just did what had to be done." Karen chuckled, unconvinced. "Well, hero or not, you turned this place upside down in a good way. Greenwood's better for it." Emily didn't answer right away. She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands as the evening hush wrapped around them. "Maybe," she said at last, her tone thoughtful, almost distant, "but it's not about me. It's about all of you's, about doing what's right, even when it's messy, even when it's hard." Karen's smile widened, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "Well, I'd say you showed us how it's done." Emily glanced out at the darkening sky, a faint curve tugging at her lips. She wasn't one for praise and never had been, but deep down, she couldn't deny the truth in Karen's words. For the first time in years, the weight she'd carried felt lighter, replaced by a quiet peace she hadn't known she'd been chasing. And as the stars began to prick through the twilight, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't a lost cause after all, not when people were willing to fight for it. The lesson here wasn't just Mike's fall. It was the cost of letting power run wild, of thinking a uniform could shield you from consequences. Greenwood learned that justice isn't handed out, it's built, brick by brick, by those brave enough to demand it. And when it's abused, the cracks show, trust crumbles, and the whole town pays the price. Emily's stand wasn't just her victory, it was a mirror held up to everyone. A reminder that power without integrity is a hollow shell, destined to collapse under its own weight.